oftentimes have to refer to these things in passing very quickly. Like we will mention, say, for instance, Vesco. We'll talk about Robert Vesco, and we'll talk about Mitch Werbel, and we'll just throw those names out in passing. And they won't mean a whole lot to people who were not around for the original broadcast where these names were introduced, or people who study them on their own. So because of this problem, and because of the fact that we had to keep going back and laboriously reiterating every single detail every time we wanted to add one new detail on the top, in other words, it's like building a new cathedral every time you want to put a new gargoyle on the roof, we decided that what we would do would prepare these archive broadcasts, and they are literally that, for the purpose of making a radio archive, a radio library in which people can hang on to these tapes. They will have the information in single subject doses. In other words, we'll only be talking about one particular area rather than ranging far and wide back across the board, because even in talking about one area, we have to range pretty far and wide. And we'll be doing these 4 hours at a time, one subject, very in-depth examinations. And of course, as we quickly found out, some of these subjects require even more than one 4-hour time slot, and we do 2, 3, 4, even 5 shows occasionally. And this is the second of the broadcasts, which are probably going to be maybe even as many as 4 broadcasts, because they're so germane to what's going on the subject of intelligence, our intelligence and military networks in this country, and their involvement with the drug trade. Okay, so one of the very important things to realize as we start this broadcast tonight is that these things are to be taped, if at all possible. We realize it's very difficult for people to sit and listen to an entire broadcast all the way through. It's going to be 4 hours. It's going to be fascinating stuff. If you're in any way, shape, or form interested in the world around you, it's going to be very interesting stuff. There's probably a lot of things about your country that you are not aware of, and about other people's countries. However, we do understand also that it is occasionally a little tough to listen to this kind of in-depth information for a long period of time. This is why we strongly recommend that this information be taped whenever possible. However, there are also available for people who do not have access to tape players. There are also there's a tape service that we utilize that does make tapes of these broadcasts, and we will give you the address later in the broadcast where you can contact these people to get copies of these tapes of these archive shows if you cannot tape them yourself. But again, if you haven't tuned in before, we strongly urge you to batten down the hatches and stay with us for a while and see if you have ever heard anything like this on your radio station.
Okay, now again, our programs are intended for use as audio reference works. There's never been a better time, as Nip indicated, to get into this kind of material. It would be, it would be more difficult to fully appreciate the broadcast we're going to be doing this evening without discussing some, at least to a certain extent, reviewing some of the major points that we covered in the first broadcast on the subject of the interrelationship between our intelligence system and the narcotics traffic. In our first broadcast, what we basically looked at was how the main elements of the international heroin trade following World War II grew directly out of the Central Intelligence Agency's Cold War policy, or really America's Cold War policy as expressed through the actions of the Central Intelligence Agency. Specifically in this regard, what we looked at in the first broadcast was the development of the French Connection and the development of the Golden Triangle in Southeast Asia. In each case, both of those major elements, and those are perhaps two of the 3 most important connections with regard to the post-war heroin trade, the other being the so-called the so-called Golden Crescent area of Southwest Asia, the Golden Triangle being in Southeast Asia, the French Connection being essentially the cooperative interrelationship between Turkish opium growers, the mafia, the Onorata Società of Sicily, and Union Chorus of Corsica. We covered the growth of the French Connection and the growth of the Golden Triangle, both stemming directly from relationships formed by the U.S. intelligence apparatus during the war, World War II, that is, which then extended into the Cold War period. Specifically, we took a look at how during World War II, the United States began working actively with the mafia in this country in 2 basic capacities. First of all, the Office of Naval Intelligence formed a liaison with Lucky Luciano's East Coast Mafia organization, and in return for basically a guarantee of freedom at the end of World War II, Luciano enlisted his mafia organization as a security organization to guard against Axis saboteurs on the docks of the east coast of the United States during World War II. In addition, the mafia elements which were allied with Luciano's American mafia organization, that is the Sicilian mafia elements allied with Luciano's American mafia organization, in turn were pressed into this World War II alliance with the mafia and assisted General Patton's landings in Sicily. following the conclusion of hostilities in Europe, or at least the conclusion of the war against Nazism, the collaboration between U.S. intelligence and the Mafia was extended. This time, the Mafia was used as a bulwark against communism, and specifically, the Mafia was placed in power in Sicily in considerable measure in order to guard against the very resurgent and lively Communist Party that was active in Sicily and throughout Italy, largely because of the popular sentiment that they enjoyed as a result of their resistance against the Nazis. So the Mafia in Sicily, which had been largely wiped out by Mussolini, was basically placed into power by U.S. intelligence at the end of World War II in order to guard against the possibility of communism in Italy and Sicily. This placed the Mafia, which then the Luciano organization, Lucky Luciano, was exiled to Sicily after being released as per his agreement with naval intelligence. The Luciano organization then became the dominant element, Sicilian element, the dominant Mafia element in the post-World War II heroin trafficking. In this regard, the Sicilian Mafia worked out a relationship, a cooperative relationship with the Union Corse, the Corsican syndicate, which operated largely out of Marseille on the mainland of France. Here, too, U.S. intelligence and our Cold War policies were front and center in establishing the so-called French connection. The Union Corse, just like the Sicilian Mafia, was actively supported by the Central Intelligence Agency at the end of after World War II in order to serve as basically an anti-communist cadre. As a result of the power that the Union Corse derived, they became the dominant element in the Marseille underworld and a very, very powerful element in southern France. The Union Corse and the Marseille gangsters were notoriously effective smugglers, and because of pressure put on some of the Sicilian heroin laboratories, which were working for the Luciano organization, the Luciano organization and the Sicilian Mafia in general worked out a cooperative relationship with Union Corse, whereby the Union Corse would refine the Mafia's heroin in Marseille. It was then transshipped to the United States. The point here being that the establishment of the French connection was made possible by the power given to two organized crime syndicates by the Central Intelligence Agency, specifically in order to function as anti-communist cadres. The Sicilian Mafia in Sicily, the Union Corse in Marseille, primarily on the mainland of France, got the power that they needed in order to become the two dominant elements in the French connection element of the international heroin trade, one of the dominant connections in the post-World War II heroin trade, as a result of the assistance they were given by U.S. intelligence after the war. Now, in Asia, we took a look again at another relationship formed during World War II by U.S. intelligence with a crime syndicate. In this case, specifically, we were taking a look at the alliance between the Office of Strategic Services and the Chiang Kai-shek security officer Tively, T-I-L-I. Tively, in turn, his organization, he was basically sort of like the security minister for Chiang Kai-shek. He was described by one observer as Chiang Kai-shek's Himmler, basically the head policeman of Chiang Kai-shek's basically fascist government in China prior to and during World War II. Now, Tively, in turn, made liberal use. His organization, the core of his organization, his security organization, was comprised of the Green Gang out of Shanghai, which was headed by a fellow named Tu Yue Sheng. The Green Gang was basically an organization which financed itself through the manipulation of the international opium trade. They were opium traffickers. They, in turn, became, under Tively, the bulk of Chiang Kai-shek's security apparatus. During World War II, U.S. intelligence actively cooperated with the Tively organization. Then, as the relationship between the nationalist Chinese elements and the U.S. national security establishment was extended into the post-World War II period, U.S. intelligence continued to cooperate with the dope-dealing elements of Chiang Kai-shek's organization, and CIA support for the residual Kuomintang elements in Southeast Asia after the fall of nationalist China, after Mao Zedong took control of the mainland of China. The CIA, in order to, again, combat communism, gave heavy support to the Kuomintang armies which had fled China for Southeast Asia. As we saw in Europe, the material assistance given to these Kuomintang elements permitted them to not only control, but to develop, far beyond what had originally been, the Golden Triangle heroin traffic in Southeast Asia. This was basically the heroin which the U.S. came across during the course of our expeditionary for our invasion of South Vietnam, or during the Vietnam War. Following that, and this will take us right up to the point we're at, where we will be beginning this broadcast, we took a look at how the French, during their phase of the Indochina War, had used the opium traffic and the profits derived thereby to put together basically a security force to finance an irregular army comprised of various ethnic tribal groups, which were in Southeast Asia, in Vietnam. Many of these groups, particularly the Hmong or Mao tribesmen in Laos, financed their activities. Their major cash crop was the opium poppy. The French facilitated the traffic of some of these indigenous groups and used the profits thereby to sustain an irregular army comprised of the Hmong and other tribal groups during the French phase of the Indochina War. This policy, to a considerable extent, was revived by the U.S. when we moved into the Indochina War. We took a look at how Nguyen Cao Ky, head of the Vietnamese Air Force and the vice president of the now-defunct South Vietnamese Republic, cooperated with a fellow named General Loan, L-O-A-N, and the two of them financed revived the security apparatus of Nguyen Van Thieu, which, again, was largely dependent on profits derived from the very lucrative opium trade in Saigon. Loan and Ky, with the active cooperation of U.S. officials, essentially controlled, they corralled the opium trade in Vietnam, used the proceeds from it and the graft from it to finance a security and an anti-Viet Cong security organization in Vietnam during the war. Beyond that, and again as a sort of development or refinement of the technique of using opium income to provide the financing for anti-communist cadres, the United States picked up where the French left off and began actively assisting the Mao or Hmong tribesmen in Laos with their opium trade. Specifically, we took a look at Air America, a CIA air proprietary, and their unfortunate habit of flying opium into South Vietnam, where, in partnership with Nguyen Cao Ky, the former head of the Vice Marshal of the Vietnamese Air Force, Vice President of the Republic under Nguyen Van Thieu, where, in partnership with General Ky and other South Vietnamese generals, the United States wound up, in essence, trafficking in opium. See, the Air America and the CIA would fly the opium grown in Laos and the Golden Triangle into Vietnam, where the South Vietnamese government, in cooperation with the United States, would then deal that very same heroin. And, of course, the main victims of the Southeast Asian heroin trade during the Vietnam War was our own GIs. The addict population of the country swelled enormously during the Vietnam War. Those addicts were being addicted by dope grown by the people we were there to protect, and those drugs were flown into Vietnam by the United States government itself. So we have a pattern, which we're going to see developing further, where the United States basically took a page from the book of the French and used the proceeds from the opium and heroin traffic to finance anti-communist armies and agents. And this is where we're going to begin this evening. We're going to take a look at perhaps one of the most startling and perhaps the most loathsome single development of our Southeast Asian policy, our Vietnam policy, the development of an organization called the Nguyen Han Bank, in which we're going to see a further development and a formalization of the habit of using dope financing to expedite and to underwrite political dealings.
Now, if you want to draw some kind of a larger allusion here to how this happened, it's fairly obvious to see that as our security forces came more and more to rely on anti-communist forces who, as Dave so aptly put it, whose primary income was oftentimes heroin or other forms of dangerous narcotics, more and more our security forces themselves, in the form of the CIA case officers and the special military intelligence people, began to find what an extremely liquid method of funding the drug traffic was. One of the reasons that drugs are such a lucrative business, besides the fact that the demand never dies off, is that because they are comparatively extremely easy to ship from one place to another. They are a very lucrative form for the amount of actual raw material that has to be moved from one place to another. In other words, there's very few other businesses where you can take something that weighs less than a pound and make hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars off of it, which you can in the drug trade. So a comparatively small amount that can be shipped rather easily and moved around by small groups of people, not needing a huge infrastructure, although those have developed. Also, in many cases, because the people involved in the drug trade, because of the illegal nature of the drug trade and because of its strong ties into the fascist anti-communist community, are also directly in contact with other people of like political minds, and there is an extremely well-organized system of drugs and guns being swapped back and forth, and money that is very difficult to trace being shot back and forth from one place to another. So as in the 1940s, late 1940s, 1950s, and 1960s, the secret team of the United States, the intelligence and military establishments, began more and more to operate outside the law, outside the charter of congressional and public approval, more and more they came up against the situation so common to people who are trying to do something and not let other people find out about it, which is, where do we get the money for it? That being the case, they were forced to take the drugs, or whatever the case might be, or the weapons, and move things back and forth, and use these systems to operate essentially a black market political economy that would allow the intelligence forces, whether they be the CIA or U.S. military forces, or in the early days the OSS, would allow them with a comparatively small, expensive manpower to set up a system whereby money could be kept flowing in almost continuously into a system, and they would have instant access to all the things that illegal or illicit or black market money could gain for them, namely weapons, the service of mercenaries, and illegal bases on which to plan and to train people and things of that nature. So as the CIA in particular and our intelligence forces in general began to see more and more their role in the post-World War II world, that as being sort of a vast secret police to keep the entire world controlled in one shape or form, to fight communism, to influence political destinies of countries all over the world, more and more they began to take their dealings underground to bypass the normal procedures altogether, and more these illicit forms of funding these things, coups and counter-coups, revolutionary insurgencies, etc., became the case. And drugs, because of the contacts that had been made with the Mafia and the Union Corse and the Kuomintang drug gangs, drugs became more and more the method by which this could be done.
All right, now we're going to begin a discussion with something which will pick up exactly where we left off at the at the end of the last broadcast, namely the development of the technique that the CIA borrowed from the French anti-insurgency policy during the first part of the Vietnam War, the habit or the technique of using the profits derived from the dope trade to finance covert operations. Initially, the so-called secret army in Laos was financed through the dope traffic. As we're going to see, an organization called the Nguyen Han Bank, which began during the Vietnam War and which in and of itself was actually a U.S. intelligence operation, plain and simple, which was established, among other things, for the express purpose of trafficking in drugs. The Nguyen Han Bank began during this same period. And this evening, specifically, we're going to take a look at the interrelationship between the narcotics trade and the arms traffic. We're going to take a look at how the CIA moves guns for drugs.
All right. The first section that we're going to read from is from the book entitled In Banks We Trust. The author is Penny Lernoux, L-E-R-N-O-U-X, and the book was originally published in hardback by Anchor Press Doubleday in 1984. Penny Lernoux writes in Chapter 4, titled Nguyen Han Murder and the Good Old Boys of the CIA. Early on a Sunday morning in 1980, two patrolmen, driving along a lonely stretch of highway near the Australian port of Sydney, came upon a Mercedes sedan with its lights on. Inside the car, slumped across the front seat in a puddle of blood, was the body of a middle-aged man. Searching his pockets, the patrolman found the business card of William Colby, former director of the CIA. On the back of the card was the itinerary of a trip Colby intended to make to Asia. Beside the body were a new rifle and a Bible with a meat pie wrapper as a placemark. On the wrapper were scrawled the names of Colby and Congressman Bob Wilson of California, then the ranking Republican on the House Armed Services Committee. The dead man turned out to be a Sydney merchant banker named Frank Nguyen, spelled N-U-G-A-N, co-owner of the Nguyen Han Bank, and Hand, H-A-N-D. His apparent suicide set off an international scandal involving heroin and arms traffickers, the CIA, and enough high-ranking U.S. military officers to launch a small war. The Nguyen Han saga is revealing as much for what it says about banks as about the CIA, for the bank was the fulcrum of a multitude of illegal and lucrative activities, from heroin running to investment swindles, as well as paymaster for CIA covert actions against Australia's Labour Party. Skipping down. Frank Nguyen was a fast learner. A thick-set man with a flair for self-promotion, Nguyen had an ingratiating manner that could, quote, charm the pants off anybody, as one colleague recalled. The son of a Spanish migrant who had done well in the food packing business, Nguyen took a law degree at the University of California and returned to Sydney, ambitious for the open combat of the business world. The young Australian was a natural partner for Michael Hand, a tough-talking Green Beret with the Special Forces in Vietnam, who visited Australia when it was a rest and recreation center for American troops. Hand left Vietnam in 1968 to settle in Sydney, where he joined forces with Nugan to promote Australian tourism, mining, and real estate through an outfit called Australasian and Pacific Holdings Limited. The company may well have been a CIA front, since 4 of the original shareholders listed Air America, the CIA airline, as their address, and 2 other investors were from a CIA-related institution. In 1973, the pair formed the Nugan Hand Bank. It attracted depositors with offers of private banking services, the highest interest rates in the region, tax-free deposits, and complete secrecy. Within 6 years, it had 22 branches around the world. But Nugan Hand's biggest business came from laundering money for Asian and Australian heroin dealers. Not coincidentally, the bank's officers read like a who's who of the CIA. Despite CIA denials of involvement, there is strong historical evidence to support the suspicion that the bank was founded to help finance the CIA's role in Southeast Asia's heroin traffic.
Continuing. As noted by scholar Alfred W. McCoy in The Politics of Heroin in Southeast Asia, after World War II, Washington believed that the United States was the rightful heir to Europe's Asian colonial empires. To legitimize their foreign adventures, America's Cold Warriors embraced a militant ideology that regarded all Asian nationalist struggles as pawns of international communism, unquote. The CIA became the vanguard of the anti-communist crusade. Any ally was welcome and any means justified. During the early 1950s, for example, the CIA backed the formation in Burma of a guerrilla army of nationalist Chinese who were responsible for almost a third of the world's illicit opium supply. In Laos, the CIA created a Mao mercenary army whose commander manufactured heroin for sale to American GIs in South Vietnam. And in late 1969, new heroin laboratories sprang up in the Golden Triangle, where Burma, Thailand, and Laos converge. The State Department, wrote McCoy, provides unconditional support for corrupt governments openly engaged in the drug traffic, unquote. In view of such activities, a drug bank set up by the CIA has a certain logic, particularly since a bank was obviously necessary to recycle the huge sums of money involved in the heroin traffic. Evidence uncovered by detectives and journalists also shows that Nugan Hand arranged arms deals in South America, Africa, and the Middle East, and served as financial intermediary for former CIA agent and notorious arms dealer Edwin P. Wilson. Records seized by the Australian authorities show further that the bank received lengthy reports about military and political activities, mostly in Cambodia, but also in Laos, Vietnam, and Thailand. They were prepared by Nugan Hand's Bangkok representative, a former career British naval officer, and seemed to have no connection with the bank's normal business. Equally suspicious, the CIA, FBI, and U.S. Customs refused, on grounds of national security, to release information that they held on the bank's activities. When the Australian weekly The National Times petitioned under the U.S. Freedom of Information Act for FBI records, it received only 71 of 151 pages requested. Of these, most had been blacked out in heavy ink with a notation B1, unquote, meaning that disclosure would endanger U.S. national defense or foreign policy. Observed Nugan Hand liquidator John O'Brien, quote, "It has obvious overtones that somebody is covering something up," unquote. The question is whether the people who ran the bank were in it for the money or because they thought they were serving a political cause. McCoy, whose observations were made in the late 1960s, did not think the CIA was in the drug traffic to finance its clandestine operations or because of a few corrupt agents. Rather, its role was the inadvertent and inevitable consequence of its Cold War tactics, unquote. But by the mid-1970s, the Cold War hysteria had passed, and political reasons for dealing with drug traffickers seemed less compelling. So either the CIA was carrying on its own private Cold War, or Nugan Hand was an intelligence cover for crime. Frank Nugan's activities suggest the latter.
Continuing with In Banks We Trust. For an agent with a cause, Nugan engaged in some funny sidelines, such as defrauding several large insurance companies of their interest in a Nugan family fruit and vegetable business, in addition to fraudulent dealings at the bank. He also lived high. Literally, he had a bottle-a-day Scotch habit, in a lavish Sydney home that he had remodeled at the cost of $500,000. The day he died, Nugent was completing negotiations for the purchase of a $2.2 million country estate, a venture that does not suggest a man about to commit suicide. Indeed, there is as much mystery surrounding Nugent's death as there is about his checkered career in banking. Though Nugent was facing criminal charges over the family food business, he seemed his charming, chipper self to the very end. In the last 6 months of his life, he had gone on the wagon, lost nearly 50 pounds on a crash diet, and taken to attending church almost daily. If the sudden changes were signs of unraveling, Nugent's associates seemed unaware of them. Hand and the other directors were taken by surprise when Nugent's body was found, as shown by an impromptu cover-up that failed to conceal the bank's illegal dealings. And, when an official inquest was held, the coroner's suicide verdict was challenged on the ground that Nugent would have to have been a, quote, contortionist, to have shot himself in the head with a rifle from the position in which he was sitting. Nor were the dead man's fingerprints found on the rifle. Even after the inquest was closed, some were still unconvinced that the body in Nugent's Mercedes was really his, and in 1982 the New South Wales Attorney General ordered an exhumation of the corpse after witnesses claimed to have seen him in a bar in Atlanta, Georgia. The remains were positively identified as Nugent's by means of teeth and a webbed foot. Much of the evidence detailing Nugent's operations was destroyed by Nugent's partner, Green Beret Michael Hand, who had often boasted of working for the CIA. When he learned of Nugent's death, Hand rushed back to Sydney from a business trip in London. He was joined by the bank's president, Earl P. Buddy Yates, retired Rear Admiral and former Chief of Staff for Strategic Planning with U.S. forces in Asia and the Pacific. Hand and Yates called the bank's other directors to an emergency meeting at the bank. Among those present was Bernie Houghton, Houghton, a former undercover agent who had worked with U.S. naval intelligence in the Pacific and was the bank's Saudi Arabian representative. According to Stephen K. A. Hill, one of the directors present at the meeting, the group shredded enough records to fill a small room. What they could not destroy, they packed in cartons and carried that night to the back room of a butcher's shop owned by a former Army sergeant in Vietnam who was an associate of Houghton. Hill said that Houghton brought along his lawyer, Michael Maloney, to oversee the ransacking, and that Maloney warned them, quote, "I am fully aware of what has been going on. You all face jail terms of up to 16 years. Hand then broke in to say if the Maloney's orders were not obeyed, quote, terrible things would happen. Quote, your wives will be cut up and returned to you in bits and pieces, unquote.
Continuing. Meanwhile, in Manila, three-star General Leroy J. Manor. Let me start again. Meanwhile, in Manila, three-star General Leroy J. Manor, the recently retired Chief of Staff for all U.S. forces in Asia and the Pacific, was trying to persuade Nugent Hand's public relations officer to stop the wire services from reporting Nugent's death. On a secret assignment for the Air Force in the Philippines, Manor was also helping to run Nugent Hand's Manila office. Nor were Manor and Yates the only high-ranking former U.S. military and intelligence officials working for the bank. General Edwin F. Black, commander of U.S. troops in Thailand during the Vietnam War and later Assistant Army Chief of Staff for the Pacific, was president of Nugent Hand's Hawaiian operations. The consulting offices of General Earl Koch, Jr., C-O-C-K-E, a retired general with the U.S. National Guard, served as Nugent Hand's Washington headquarters. On the intelligence side, Nugent Hand associates included William Colby, director of the CIA between 1973 and 6, who served as a lawyer for the bank. Walter McDonald, a former deputy director of the CIA who worked as a consultant. Guy Pauker, P-A-U-K-E-R, a CIA advisor, also a consultant, and Dale Holmgren, flight service manager for a CIA-run airline in the Far East known as Civil Air Transport, who opened Nugent Hand's Taipei branch. The bank's man in Manila was Roy Manor, a CIA consultant involved in the aborted rescue mission of American hostages in Iran. Robert Red Jansen, former CIA station chief in Bangkok, represented Nugent Hand in Thailand. Also linked to the bank were the CIA station chief of Australia and 2 CIA case officers. The beginnings of this star-studded assembly can be traced to the Vietnam War, which had brought together such people as Houghton and Hand. Like Hand, Houghton took up residence in Sydney, where he opened a chain of restaurants that would later play host to U.S. congressmen, CIA officials, and military brass, including Representative Wilson's Armed Services Committee. Hand had had some experience in real estate promotion as a salesman for a development project promoted by the singer Pat Boone, and financed by the American shipping magnate D.K. Ludwig. According to confidential reports obtained by the Australian Federal Bureau of Narcotics, Hand later used that landing strip constructed on the real estate development for heroin flights made from Asia to Australia by an Air America pilot. As acknowledged by U.S. drug enforcement officials, Air America figured prominently in the CIA's heroin traffic from Southeast Asia's Golden Triangle.
Continuing, the bank was also actively engaged in the drug trade. One of its principal branches was in Chiang Mai, in the heart of Thailand's poppy-growing fields. Australia's biggest drug pushers operated out of this region. They also banked with Nugan Hand. Among the bank's clients was the $100 million Mr. Asia heroin syndicate, which also arranged for the contract murders of at least 3 persons in Australia. Neil Evans, former head of the Chiang Mai branch, testified that during 6 months at the bank he saw millions of drug dollars pass through the branch. He also said that Hand had told him that he had arranged for Nugan Hand to become the CIA's paymaster, quote, for disbursement of funds anywhere in the world on behalf of the CIA, and also for the taking of money on behalf of the CIA. Evans' charges confirm those of Peter Wilcox, an American energy consultant who said he met Hand in Singapore on the recommendation of General Black, himself a graduate of the CIA's wartime predecessor, the Office of Strategic Services, otherwise known as the OSS. Wilcox said that Hand and Nugan tried to recruit him for the bank with the story that he was needed for, quote, deep cover work as part of an unidentified intelligence operation. Wilcox declined the offer. Later, his military friends told him that the bank was moving, quote, unbelievable amounts of money covertly out of Australia, Indonesia, and Thailand. The bank apparently was able to carry on such operations because of highly placed contacts at the Australian Federal Bureau of Narcotics. One of the Bureau's informants worked for the bank, and he tipped off investigators. Quote, they are bigger than anything you have ever seen here in the heroin game, and are said to be part of an American security organization. If you caught these blokes, all hell would break loose. The day after these allegations, the informant found himself being tailed instead of Nugan or Hand. The informant found himself being tailed instead of Nugan or Hand. Within a year, it had become apparent to the investigators that Frank Nugan had direct access to Bureau information, which he often obtained within hours of its internal appearance. According to a former Bureau officer, quote, Nugan was getting to hear about our inquiries literally before we could even update our holdings on them. In 1978, the Bureau's director placed on file a memo suspending any further investigation into Nugan Hand. A year later, the Bureau was disbanded.
Continuing. The bank also had fruitful contacts with the Australian Security Intelligence Organization, ASIO, a secret counter-spy group that worked closely with the CIA and may have been responsible for the Narcotics Bureau's strange behavior in the Nugan Hand case. Statements by 2 FBI agents sent to Australia in 1982 and an ultra-secret wiretap of Frank Nugan's phone suggest that ASIO was involved in the affair. Australian immigration records also show that a senior ASIO official vouched for Nugan Hand's ubiquitous Houghton when he entered Australia in 1972 with an expired visa. On ASIO's word, he received a visa allowing him to travel and leave Australia at will. The Pentagon operates a vital base at Pine Gap in central Australia, which monitors U.S. satellites watching the USSR and China and directs the United States nuclear submarines. When the Labour Party was voted into power in 1972, Prime Minister Gough Whitlam, that's G-O-U-G-H-W-H-I-T-L-A-M, When the Labour Party was voted into power in 1972, Prime Minister Gough Whitlam quickly antagonized Washington by pulling Australian troops out of Vietnam and condemning President Nixon for the bombing of Hanoi. But nothing so enraged the CIA and ASIO as Whitlam's repeated criticisms of the Pine Gap installation. Ray Klein, former CIA Deputy Director of Intelligence, later confirmed a joint CIA-ASIO plan to destabilize the Whitlam government through misinformation and contribution to opposition politicians. The Nugan Hand Bank played an important role in the fall of Whitlam's government in November of 1975 by financing bugging and forgery operations. I'm going to repeat that last sentence again. The Nugan Hand Bank played an important role in the fall of Whitlam's government in November of 1975 by financing bugging and forgery operations. A former executive of the bank also told Inquiry magazine that under William Colby, the CIA laundered millions of dollars through Nugan Hand to support pro-U.S. political parties in Europe, allegedly including Italy's Christian Democrats. The bank was founded while William Colby was director of the CIA, and he continued to play a part in its affairs after he left the agency, including Nugan Hand's mysterious Panama branch and an attempt to take over a Florida bank.
Finishing up our segment from In Banks We Trust. In addition to drugs, Nugan Hand was involved in various arms deals with Indonesia, Thailand, Malaysia, Brazil, and the White Rhodesian government of Ian Smith. The bank also did business with Edwin Wilson, the former CIA agent convicted in the United States of selling explosives to Libya and charged with supplying trained men, arms, and technology to Libya and other military buyers. Memos and testimony by Nugan Hand employees show that Hand met with Wilson in Bangkok and that Houghton held discussions with him in Switzerland. Intelligence sources also claim that Houghton used Nugan Hand's Saudi Arabian branch to finance Wilson's arms smuggling operations. In view of such activities, one might ask why so many high-ranking U.S. military men lent their names and prestige to the bank. Part of the answer may lie in the U.S. intelligence community's obvious ties to Nugan Hand. While Colby and Admiral Yates denied any connection between the CIA and the bank, General Black was not so sure. Quote, "I'm not saying it's not possible," he allowed, "but I certainly wasn't aware of it." Walter McDonald, the Nugan Hand consultant and former CIA deputy director, was also uncertain. Quote, "I really don't see it happening, but I can't vouch for it." Unquote. Technically, they may have been correct, since the bank apparently was originally part of a deep cover intelligence operation known as Task Force 157, which worked with the CIA but was controlled by the U.S. Office of Naval Intelligence and was directly responsible to strong-willed Secretary of State Henry Kissinger. The task force gained notoriety when 21 of its former agents took the Navy to court to demand civil service benefits after the group was abruptly disbanded in 1977 because of some unknown internal scandal. Ed Wilson had a desk and his own staff at the task force's Washington headquarters and is credited with supplying the operation's front name, Pierce Morgan. Informed sources said that Task Force 157 used the Nugan Hand Bank for covert naval intelligence money, just as the CIA used it to undermine Australia's Labour government. According to the National Times of Australia, General Black figured prominently in the bank's operations, having previously been, quote, in charge of various paramilitary operations in Asia involving a number of unorthodox financing arrangements, unquote. Well, the history of the Nugan Hand Bank, as we have all seen, is a history of unorthodox financing arrangements, and the history of the CIA's involvement of the drug trade could be rather simply summed up that same way, and rather unorthodox set of financing arrangements. Before we go back into this in depth, for those of you, again, who are just tuning in and have not heard of Radio Free America before and are curious as to why exactly we're talking about these kinds of things, well, the interest or the self-interest of anybody in what their government is doing is obvious, but even more so with Iran-Gate and Contra-Gate going on, because as we read on one of our regular broadcasts during the week, there are allegations in the committee of Senator John Kerry of Massachusetts that the Contras were using some of the money given to them by the Reagan administration to ship upwards of a ton a week of cocaine into this country. As you will recall earlier in this article from In Banks We Trust, we were reading about one of the things that Penny Lareau was talking about was the fact that the CIA has put together over the years a set of arrangements with these mercenary right-wing groups, anti-communist groups, and has literally funded their activities by allowing them to sell drugs unhindered to the American people. And it's entirely possible, as a matter of fact, it's more than entirely possible, it's damned likely that that's exactly what's going on with the Contras, as we have seen, and we will talk about later.
This coming Sunday, by the way, for those people who are in a position to hear this live, be tuned in, and during what is normally a phone-in talk show, we're going to be reading for 3 hours and do kind of a mini archive show about Contra-Gate and its intersection with the national security establishment's arms and drugs traffic. So, again, before we go back and sort of sum up and review some of the major points of Nugan Hand, bear in mind that this bank, engaged openly in the arms traffic and the narcotics traffic, is a U.S. intelligence operation, involved large elements of CIA, also appears to have intersected heavily with a special U.S. naval intelligence group, Task Force 157, effectively controlled by Henry Kissinger, involving, among others, Ed Wilson, who we've looked at in so many other programs, chiefly Radio Free America number 4. I'd like to read a story by way of reviewing the cast of characters here for the Nugan Bank. Here are some of the people, again, although the names were mentioned in Penny Lanew's section from In Banks We Trust, I'm going to review some of the names again that figure prominently in the Nugan story. This is from an article in the Wall Street Journal of August 24th, 1982. This is put together by a Wall Street Journal staff reporter. It's headlined, Admirals and Generals and ex-CIA men took prominent roles in Nugan Bank at State Line, Sydney, Australia. Enough top-ranking U.S. military and intelligence officers worked for Nugan to run a small-sized war. The list includes Admiral Earl Buddy Yates, a 1943 graduate of the U.S. Naval Academy, Legion of Honor winner in Vietnam, and commander of the aircraft carrier USS John F. Kennedy. Then he was the Chief of Staff for Plans and Policy of the U.S. Pacific Command, in charge of all strategic planning from California to the Persian Gulf until his retirement in July of 1974. He became the president of Nugan Bank early in 1977, recruited by Maurice Bernard Houghton, who apparently is an old friend. General Leroy J. Manor, M-A-N-O-R, the Chief of Staff for the entire Pacific Command until he retired in July of 1978 to undertake new duties that the Air Force says are so secret that it can't talk about them. These duties are generally known to have included negotiating the 1979 agreement with the Philippine government for continuance of the U.S. military bases there, which General Manor used to command, and investigating the failed hostage rescue raid in Iran in 1980, an assignment that apparently stemmed from his having designed and commanded the 1970 raid on a North Vietnamese prison camp that failed to find any U.S. prisoners. A much-decorated Air Force three-star general, he also had been the special assistant to the Joint Chiefs of Staff at the Pentagon for counterinsurgency and special activities, unquote. He joined Nugan Manila office, allegedly to run it, which he denies, in 1979. General Edwin F. Black, a 1940 graduate of West Point. He entered the Office of Strategic Services, the OSS, which later became the CIA and was the OSS commander in Berlin. He was the chief administrative aide to and frequent chess opponent of Allen Dulles, who became the head of the CIA. He was the wartime boss and then tennis partner of Richard Helms, who also became the head of the CIA. He was on the National Security Council staff under President Eisenhower, and later the commander of all U.S. troops in Thailand during the Vietnam War, before becoming Assistant Army Chief of Staff for the Pacific. He retired in 1970 to become Executive Vice President of the Freedoms Foundation in Valley Forge, Pennsylvania, a group promoting conservative politics. He also worked for LTV Corporation, an important CIA contractor. In 1977, he became the president of Nugan Incorporated Hawaii and special representative of the overall organization, making frequent trips to Asia. He says he was recruited by Admiral Yates and another admiral, General Earl Koch, Jr., C-O-C-K-E, whose entry in Who's Who in America says that during World War II, he was prisoner of war 3 times, actually executed, unquote, by a German firing squad, and delivered the coup de grace but survived 1945. He held various posts with the Defense Department as an executive with Delta and then Peruvian Airlines. He is a former national commander of the American Legion, honorary commander of the Nationalist Chinese Air Force, and holder of the French Legion of Honor and top medals from Spain, the Philippines, and Italy. Now listed as a retired general with the U.S. National Guard and a consultant. His continuing office served as Nugan Washington office. His consulting office served as Nugan Washington office. William Colby, the U.S. Director of Central Intelligence, 1973 through 6. He ran intelligence programs in Vietnam during the war. In 1979 and 1980, as a lawyer with the Wall Street firm of Reed and Priest, he worked for Nugan on a variety of matters: tax problems, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, an abortive project to relocate Indo-Chinese refugees on an island in either the Caribbean or the Pacific, an attempt to take over a Florida bank, the operations of Nugan mysterious Panama branch, and the problems surrounding Mr. Nugan's death. Mr. Colby submitted $46,000 in bills which weren't paid. A $10,000 check for his retainer was issued, but never cashed. Walter McDonald, a career CIA officer since 1975 and deputy director in charge of economic research from 1972 to 1977. Then, while still in the CIA, he helped his former boss, one-time CIA Director James Schlesinger, set up and run the U.S. Energy Department. He served on the National Foreign Intelligence Board, the senior advisory group in the intelligence community. He announced his retirement in 1979, went into consulting, and almost immediately, by his own account, began spending most of his time with Nugan Hand, traveling in the U.S. and Europe with Mr. Nugan and talking with him daily. Guy Pauker, P-A-U-K-E-R, a Rand Corporation staff member who has advised the CIA and other government agencies since the 1950s, although he denies reports that he is a career employee of the CIA. Mr. MacDonald, whom he calls his good friend, unquote, once said that Mr. Pauker has long had frequent personal access to White House National Security advisors, including Henry Kissinger and Zbigniew Brzezinski. Mr. Pauker went to work as a consultant to Nugan Hand after Admiral Yates introduced him to Messrs. Nugan and Hand. He, in turn, introduced them to Mr. MacDonald. Mr. Pauker says he wasn't involved in any completed deals for the bank. Dale Holmgren, H-O-L-M-G-R-E-N, a former U.S. Army officer in Taiwan who became manager of flight services for Civil Air Transport, a CIA-run airline in the Far East. He then went into business in Taiwan. He opened the Nugan Hand branch in Taipei in 1978 as a one-man representative. Admiral Yates once said that Mr. Holmgren had long worked with the U.S. military in Taiwan to develop, quote, within the social structure of the Chinese in Taipei, a close relationship with the U.S. military forces and the business and government community, unquote. Admiral Yates also said that Mr. Holmgren had worked for Nugan Hand without pay at least for a while because he had an independent income. Robert Red Jansen, a former CIA station chief in Bangkok, who advised Thai governments through almost daily meetings with the Prime Minister in the early 1970s, according to persons close to them. He worked for Nugan Hand there in 1978, although he apparently severed his relationship that year, according to a colleague, because he was warned by the U.S. Embassy that his presence at the bank had aroused suspicion. Mr. Jansen apparently has an unlisted number and couldn't be reached for comment. And before we go back to review some of the machinations that Nugan Hand was involved in, I'd like to read you one other short section of another article in that very same edition of the Wall Street Journal. This again from the Wall Street Journal of Tuesday, August 24th, 1982, the first article in a fine three-part series run on the 24th, 5th, and 6th of August of 1982. The article is by Wall Street Journal writer Jonathan Quitney, K-W-I-T-N-Y, whose work we've used before, and it's headlined, Australian Mystery. The collapse of Nugan Hand Bank discloses links with some high-ranking American military and intelligence officials. And there's a person whose name here crops up in connection with Nugan Hand, who we're going to be looking at considerably greater length this coming Sunday in connection with the Contragate Iran affair, at which, as Nip indicated earlier, drug smuggling on the part of our government is a central issue. Reading from Quitney's article from 8/24/82. When Vice President George Bush visited Australia this April, that would have been April of '82, Labour Party leader Bill Hayden, a strong possibility to become Prime Minister, used his 30-minute meeting with Mr. Bush mostly to press for the release of details on the Nugan Hand and Whitlam affairs. Mr. Bush only gave his assurances that the CIA wasn't involved in either matter. Mr. Bush was the CIA director in 1976, succeeding Mr. Colby, who later was to become a lawyer for Nugan Hand. So George Bush, during his tenure as director of the CIA, was one of the CIA directors to whom, under whom the Nugan Hand Bank operated. Remember now that Nugan Hand, although nominally a naval intelligence operation, also served as a major element in the CIA's arsenal in Southeast Asia. Now again, the major points of this bank are as follows. This was a bank which was set up as a U.S. intelligence operation. As indicated in Penny Lernew's book, although it was nominally a naval intelligence operation, it also worked very, very closely with the CIA. Now, in that capacity, the Nugan Hand Bank served as a broker for the CIA's drug deals. Those drug deals, remember, as we looked at in Radio Free America number 24, the first program in this series, went in considerable measure to finance anti-communist mercenaries in the Vietnam War. Okay, we took a look at the Hmong tribesmen, we took a look at the security operation in Saigon proper, both financed primarily by the dope trade. And obviously many of the people involved in Nugan Hand were not only some of the CIA officials in Thailand and Vietnam, but also notice the preponderance of China lobby people as well. We looked at the evolution of the China lobby, our wartime alliance with tively and the Green Gang of Tu Yuesheng, how that eventually gave rise to CIA Kuomintang cooperation in establishing the Golden Triangle heroin growing area, or opium growing area in the first place. Perhaps most significantly, In addition to the serving as a bank for as a repository for the drug money that the CIA was generating in order to finance covert operations, Nugenhand also served to finance arms deals. And the chief name that we want to take note of in connection with these arms deals and the operation of Nugenhand in general, Edwin Wilson, who along with Frank Turple not only helped train and arm Muammar Gaddafi's terrorist cadre themselves, but also obviously have had their fingers in just about every manure pie that's hit the United States in the face in the last 10 to 15 years. We'll be coming back to Turple and Wilson on Sunday's program in connection with Iran-Contra. We've already looked at him in connection with a wide variety of activities.
While we're on the subject of George Bush, too, I wanted to put in a quick mark a quick indicator in the margin by the name of George Bush. You notice in the article from 1982 that Dave read from the Wall Street Journal, the Jonathan Quitney article accompanying the long Who's Who, that in that George Bush was talking to a member of the Labour Party in Australia. This is in 1982, and assuring him that, among other things, that the CIA had nothing to do with the downfall of the Whitlam government. Interestingly enough, the fall of the Whitlam government was completed in 1975. George Bush, of course, was DCIA, director of the CIA, in 75 and 76. So, as happened today, again, December 3rd, when this show is being aired originally, George Bush flatly denied his involvement in the Contra arms deals as well as the Contra drug dealing today in a national interview. Bear in mind, in 1982, he was flatly denying the CIA's proven involvement with the fall of the Whitlam government during his tenure as director of the CIA. So again, this is something coming up this Sunday that good old George Bush is probably going to be coming under some surveillance as well as Ed Wilson and the others.
Now, not only did the Nugenhand Bank, and again, the point can't be overemphasized that this was specifically a U.S. intelligence operation set up in large measure to bankroll the CIA's drug profits. It was also used to broker CIA arms deals around the world, and perhaps most significantly, as just touched on by Nip Tuck, the Nugenhand Bank was used as an element in the destabilization of the Whitlam government in Australia. The government of not only a nation not hostile to the U.S., but of a U.S. military ally, Australia, was systematically destabilized and removed. One of the central elements, as indicated by Penny Lernoux in this Australian coup, in effect, was the Nugenhand Bank. And again, some of the key names to remember: Edwin Wilson, Henry Kissinger, that long list of Army and CIA brass and Navy brass that we looked at a little earlier. And again, remembering that this is essentially an outgrowth of our policy in Southeast Asia, where we saw the U.S. take a page from the French's book and begin financing operations through the dope trade. And here we have an organization set up in large measure as a dope-financed covert operations hub, I guess you could say. And again, remember the people involved in this. Remember that this bank, in essence, a criminal enterprise, was a U.S. government operation.
All right. And as we're going to come back and post-mortem a little bit more on Nugenhand and also begin to follow the actual trail of CIA-sponsored drugs into the United States, we hope you will stick with us. Meanwhile, we're going to take a break to give everybody a chance to get up and move around, and Dave and myself a chance to rest the vocal cords. And then we will return with, as I said, more information on the drug trade itself and a more specific look at how some of the drugs come into the country and who brings them in. Okay, so don't go away. We'll be back with more of One Step Beyond, tonight it's Radio Free America. As you heard last, we were talking at great length, of course, about the Nugenhand Bank, the bank set up apparently by CIA and military officials to launder drug profits, to be paymaster for various Asian operations of the CIA and other American organizations, to work for the Task Force 157 group headed up by Henry Kissinger under the auspices of the Office of Naval Intelligence, and also apparently to receive money garnered in other ways, the drug trade among them, and launder them for purposes that many of which we will just have to wonder about, and we may never find out, and probably never would have found out if Frank Nugen, the man who was one of the founders of the bank, hadn't died in a way still not explained in his car by the side of the road one day in Australia in 1980.
So again, this was an operation set up not only in order to bank the CIA's drug profits, but in turn to use those proceeds to finance further operations. Sort of a self-perpetuating CIA and naval intelligence dope operation in considerable measure. And again, the arms trafficking side, the drug trafficking side, and the overthrow of the Whitlam government are front and center here. Remember also the Edwin Wilson connection and the impressive variety of military and U.S. military and intelligence officials who intersect with this bank at one area or in one area or another. We're now going to take a look at another U.S. operation, a U.S. covert operation, which was in essence a drug-dealing operation, and in turn, the proceeds from those drug deals were used not only to finance the arms trade, but to destabilize another government friendly to the United States. This U.S. intelligence operation we're going to be looking at takes place in Mexico, and this operation, and again, this is a dope-dealing operation run, in essence, by the U.S. government, was used to destabilize the Echeverria government in Mexico.
All right. The segment we're going to read to you is from a truly fine book called The Great Heroin Coup, subtitled Drugs, Intelligence, and International Fascism. We used this a great deal on the broadcast. It was sort of the next step up from the book we quoted from at great length last week, which was The Politics of Heroin in Southeast Asia by Alfred McCoy. This was the next step, and this was where the picture began to emerge that not only was the CIA involved in the drug trade and various other parts of the government involved in the drug trade, but that it was not merely for the sake of convenience, but in fact it was as a specific way of financing covert operations. And that's what we're going to begin to be talking about in this part of the broadcast. Anyway, The Great Heroin Coup, Drugs, Intelligence, and International Fascism by Heinrich Kruger, a Danish journalist. And the book is copyrighted 1980 by South End Press of Boston.
Has a fine foreword, by the way, by Peter Dale Scott, a professor at the University of California at Berkeley, himself one of the premier researchers in this field and someone whose work we use frequently.
Absolutely. All right, reading from The Great Heroin Coup. They're talking now about the Mexican heroin traffic and the fact that the traffic of Mexican heroin traffic was controlled at the time of this writing, in 1980, largely by 7 Mexican families. And they start off with one that's very important to our point of view, although, in fact, as you will see, it's not really a Mexican family at all. Alberto Cecilia Falcon. The last name is spelled Sicilia-Falcon, like Falcon. Alberto Cecilia Falcon, leader of the Cecilia Falcons, is not a Mexican at all. He was born in Matanzas, Cuba. He and his family left the island immediately after Castro's takeover to become part of Miami's Cuban exile milieu. After the Bay of Pigs invasion, he was trained by the CIA at Fort Jackson for Operation 40. From there, his trail is faint for several years. However, according to Mexican police, he was in Chile helping the CIA to undermine the government of Salvador Allende. In mid-1973, he turned up in Mexico, where in record time he established a gigantic heroin and marijuana ring. According to DEA Director Peter Benzinger, in 1975, the ring numbered more than 1,600, including film stars and international businessmen. Cecilia Falcon himself resided in villas in Tijuana and San Diego. Heroin was transported to San Diego from a warehouse in Culiacan, marijuana from a processing plant in Mexicali to a U.S. distribution center in Coronado Cays. In late 1973, one of Cecilia Falcon's truckers was stopped on his way back to Mexico. The truck was loaded with arms bound for Nicaragua. According to a later report in the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, one illegal weapons dealer in Brownsville, Texas alone supplied Cecilia Falcon with 12 million rounds of ammunition in 1974. The guns for drugs traffic proceeded unhindered until early 1975, when the government of then-President Luis Echeverria discovered that Cecilia Falcon's weapon shipments went to groups in Mexico. Quote, "External forces are attempting to destabilize our country," said Echeverria in a 1975 speech, in obvious reference to his neighbor to the north. Then the Mexicans began an intense surveillance of Cecilia Falcon, who, they learned, often met and conversed by telephone with a mystery man in Cuernavaca, some 90 kilometers south of Mexico City. When a lemonade bottle bearing the man's fingerprints was sent to the FBI, the Bureau informed Mexican authorities that the man was Sam Giancana, the Chicago Mafia capo, heroin trafficker, and CIA collaborator. The Mexicans agreed to a French extradition request for Giancana, but when his Paris-bound plane stopped over in Houston, Giancana was whisked away by U.S. agents. Soon thereafter, he was found murdered in his Chicago mansion. Mexican Interior Ministry officials claimed the CIA had done all it could to prevent the mobster's extradition.
Continuing with Kruger's account. On July 2nd, 1975, Cecilia Falcon was arrested. Under rough interrogation, he claimed to be an agent of the CIA and said that his drug ring had been set up on orders from and with the support of the agency. Repeating that last sentence again. On July 2, 1975, Cecilia Falcone was arrested. Under rough interrogation, he claimed to be an agent of the CIA and said that his drug ring had been set up on orders from and with the support of the agency. Part of his profits were to go towards the purchase of weapons and ammunition for distribution throughout Central America for the destabilization of undesirable governments. If true, U.S. heroin addicts were again footing the bill for clandestine paramilitary operations and anti-communist terror campaigns. And Cecilia Falcone and his syndicate associates were not short of funds. In his possession, police found 2 Swiss bank books to the tune of $260 million. Still, the strange testimony of Alberto Cecilia Falcone did not end with his confession. His family's heroin and arms shipments continued, and on April 26, 1976, he and 3 of his lieutenants escaped from Lecumberri prison through an electrically lit, 100-yard-long tunnel dug from outside. They were recaptured 3 days later, at which time Cecilia Falcone, fearing for his life at the hands of the CIA, requested transfer to another prison and additional security. Echeverria and Cecilia Falcone each were right about the destabilization program. FBI documents released later disclosed that between 1970 and 1976, the FBI served as a secret link between the U.S. Embassy in Mexico City and the U.S. Border Patrol in California and Texas in order to destabilize the government of President Echeverria. J. Edgar Hoover had believed that Echeverria had surrounded himself with, quote, old communists and Communist Party sympathizers, unquote. A memo from Hoover to the U.S. legal attaché praises the detonation of strategic and effective bombs in Mexico City, unquote, and the wave of night machine gunnings to divide subversive leaders, unquote. Besides Echeverria's progressive attitude, another reason for U.S. hostility towards his government was the Mexican president's refusal to approve World Bank and International Monetary Fund plans for the exploitation of Mexico's newly discovered oil reserves. The first order of business of his successor, José López Portillo, in 1976, was approval of those same plans. And the newspaper El Sol de Mexico wrote shortly after the latter's inauguration that year, quote, the new government is not interested in publicity regarding the Cecilia Falcone case. It will quietly extradite him to the U.S. as soon as the new extradition agreement between the 2 countries comes into effect, unquote. In the Cecilia Falcone case, the DEA and CIA struggled bitterly against one another. It was symptomatic of a split within the DEA's own ranks, a split rooted in the effective control of its narcotics intelligence division by transplanted agents of the CIA. And this split within the DEA is something we're going to be going into in the 3rd program in our series. However, now we're going to take a couple of minutes just to review the Cecilia Falcone connection for you.
All right. Well, as mentioned here, Alberto Cecilia Falcone was a leading member of the Mexican heroin traffic. And in fact, when he himself was involved in the traffic at the same time, he was also involved with the transshipment of large amounts of arms. Now, as we said before, one of the main reasons that the government, the CIA and other aspects of the American government in particular, but probably many other governments as well, have gotten involved in the drug traffic is because it's an easily transportable source of revenue. And in many cases, it's also, the same people are also involved with the international illegal arms shipment market. So it makes it very easy to move these back and forth. So Alberto Cecilio Falcone, not only being one of the leading drug dealers in heroin and marijuana, also was found to be moving guns backwards down the pipeline back into Mexico and Central America. And when discovered, when arrested, he explained that, in fact, his drug network, his entire network, was set up with the permission and the aid of the CIA for the purpose of funding destabilization attempts on various governments. And as it turned out, one of the governments that was being destabilized was, as they protested at the time to a chorus of rude catcalls from the United States government, was in fact the Echeverria government of Mexico, who J. Edgar Hoover, among other people, found to be full of quote-unquote communist sympathizers. So again, we have the situation, as we have seen many other times, as we just saw with Gough Whitlam's Labour Party in Australia, of the United States not only using illicit drug traffic to supply CIA and other intelligence activities, but using that illicit drug traffic to in fact destabilize friendly governments of allies. One has to wonder at this point if there is any limit to the depths to which these people will sink in the pursuit of their particular political goals. And as, again, bringing this up to the present day, as we see the unraveling of the, quote, Iran-Gate/Contra-Gate case, and we see the thieves hurrying around to rat on each other, as is beginning to happen, making deals right and left, we will begin to see, well, we've already begun to see, the outlines of a similar type of operation on a much larger scale that are beginning to come clear.
And again, in the interrelationship between the arms trade and the symbiotic relationship between the arms and drugs traffic in the Cecilia Falcone ring, and in turn, the use of the profits derived from the guns and drugs to destabilize other governments. And in this case, the destabilization of the Echeverria government, in certain respects, recalls the destabilization of the Gough-Whitlam government, involving in considerable measure the Nugan-Hand Bank. Now, for about the next roughly 2 hours of our program, what we're going to be doing is, in essence, dipping back into our own archives. What we're going to be talking about for about the next 2 hours concerns an arms for drugs ring, which, again, was a U.S. intelligence operation almost exclusively. And that arms for drugs ring is called STIBOM, S-T-I-B-A-M. We covered STIBOM in Radio Free America show number 20, the fourth in our 5 programs done in May of 1986 about Italian politics, Italian covert politics, and in particular, the shooting of Pope John Paul II in May of 1981. On this evening's broadcast, we're going to recap and recapitulate roughly 2 hours or so of the most important material about STIBOM for 2 reasons. Not only is it very important in the context of the current discussion, the use of the drug trade in order to finance covert operations and the interrelationship between the drug trade and the arms trade, that our national security apparatus operates the one to finance the other in considerable measure, but in particular, a couple of details, several important details, of the STIBOM arms for drugs ring at this point appear to be pointing in exactly the same direction as the Contra-Gate-Iran-Gate situation. We don't know yet whether the two will eventually hook up, but it's beginning to look that way. And we're going to recap the STIBOM material not only because it's very important in terms of our present context, but it appears to point in the direction of Iran-Gate-Contra-Gate. And again, Iran-Gate-Contra-Gate is something that at bottom appears to also involve the interrelationship of the arms trade and drug trade and involvement in the drug trade by our national security establishment. That's one of the elements front and center in the STIBOM arms for drugs ring. And what we're going to be doing now is recapping recapping a section of Radio Free America number 20, this from May, actually this was May 22nd, 1986. And this will last us roughly the next couple of hours or so.
This article is from the San Francisco Examiner for Thursday, November 25th, 1982. It's headlined, Biggest, in quotes, Arms Ring Busted. Subheaded, Italians Swapped Copters, Tanks for Heroin. Dateline, Varese, Italy. UPI Wire story. Investigators cracked what was called, quote, the world's biggest illegal arms trafficking organization that sent millions of weapons to the Middle East in return for heroin and other drugs. Judge Carlo Palermo, in charge of the investigation, said yesterday that the arms the organization sent to various Middle East countries included helicopters, German Leopard tanks, and machine guns. I should just mention that a little later on the broadcast we'll find out that there were weapons even more impressive than Leopard tanks and helicopters involved. Continuing with the article. In return, the Milan-based organization brought into Italy heroin and other drugs through agents in Turkey and other Middle East countries, the judge said. He said most of the drugs went to northern Europe, but some also went to southern Italy and Sicily, where the mafia runs a multi-million-dollar racket smuggling drugs to the United States. Quote, we have cracked the world's biggest illegal arms trafficking organization, which had Milan and the Middle East as its terminals, unquote, Palermo said. Making another insert, when they say they had Milan, it had Milan as its headquarters, as we will find out later in the broadcast. Not only did it have Milan as its headquarters, but it had a very specific and very interesting, for our purpose, building as its headquarters in Milan. Going along with the article. Quote, over a period of years, they sent millions of war weapons, including heavy tanks and helicopters, to the Middle East, for which they were paid in narcotics, unquote. The judge said 41 members of the ring have been arrested and would face trial in February. Arrest warrants have been issued against another 159 suspects, but action on these would depend on the outcome of the continuing investigation, he said. The investigation started in December 1980, as a routine check into drug running in the Milan area. A Turk named Asim Akajah reportedly gave police information that led to the discovery of 310 pounds of heroin buried in zinc packets near a villa in Bolzano and a hotel in Trento in the Alpine region of northeast Italy. But the judge said the full extent of the arms for drugs ring emerged only recently when police arrested Henry Arsan, A-R-S-A-N, age 70, a Syrian in Varese. Judge Palermo described Arsan as, quote, a big shot in the world scene of arms trafficking. Police also jailed Arsan's Italian wife, Giovanna, age 54, on charges of taking part in illegal arms and drug trafficking. From documents found in Arsan's possession, police located the headquarters of the ring in an import-export company in Milan called Stibam, S-T-I-B-A-M, Stibam International Transport. The judge gave no indication where the tanks and helicopters came from, but press reports said the gang had links with weapons manufacturers in France, West Germany, and Belgium. Okay, a couple of points to make. As we will find out, not only France, West Germany, and Belgium, but they had intense and very close and, in fact, governmental ties with arms manufacturers in the United States. Also, as mentioned before, Stibam's head offices were in Milan, as we will find out. I don't want to spoil the surprise for those of you who don't know, in a very interesting location in Milan.
Okay, and remember Henry Arsan and the name Stibam, because those are the main focuses for the rest of the broadcast. The day after the article Nip just read you appeared, specifically November 26, 1982, the following article appeared in the same paper, the San Francisco Examiner. On 11/26/82, the Examiner ran this story, an AP story out of Milan, under the headline, Did Big Italian Bank Finance Arms Gang? And the subhead is, Smugglers Had an Office in Its Building. It reads as follows. Italian police are investigating whether the scandal-plagued, bankrupt Banco Ambrosiano financed an international gang of arms and drug smugglers, says Italian TV. Police began questioning bank officials yesterday after it was learned that the smugglers, described by a magistrate as the largest world organization of illegal arms traffic, unquote, had an office above an Ambrosiano branch in Milan, the state TV channel RAI said. I would interrupt that is the main branch, the headquarters of Banco Ambrosiano. Continuing. The former vice president of the Ambrosiano, Roberto Rassone, denied that the bank was involved, RAI reported. Investigators said the gang furnished Middle East countries, including Iran, with arms exported illegally from Europe and the United States. It named no other countries. Helicopters and armored cars were exported illegally in exchange for narcotics, the investigating magistrate Carlo Palermo was quoted as saying, and the drugs, mainly heroin, were then sold in Europe. Police captured the alleged head of the gang, Henry Arsan, a 70-year-old Syrian, and his Italian wife, Giovanna, 54. The magistrate said they were charged with illegal traffic of arms and narcotics. Arsan owned a hauling company that occupied offices rented from Banco Ambrosiano in Milan and served as a front for the gang, police said. Warrants are out for 200 other suspected members of the gang, including several Greeks, Turks, and Yugoslavs, Palermo said. During a 2-year investigation, police discovered that the gang had invested proceeds in banks in Austria, West Germany, and Switzerland. Police began working on the case in 1980 after a Lebanese Turk named Asim Akaya tipped off his brother, a police officer. Other press reports said that the smugglers were working in collaboration with the Sicilian mafia. So, this huge arms for drug smuggling ring, and bear in mind Mehmet Ali Ejah and the Grey Wolves' connections to drug smuggling from that part of the world and the speculation about the Abdi Apeki murder, Arsan's arms for drugs ring, the largest illegal arms exporting operation in the world, is not only located right above Banco Ambrosiano's headquarters in Milan, but is rented from Banco Ambrosiano. It was from the windows of that building that Roberto Calvi's secretary and the late unfortunate Alberto Della Ca basically they went from the windows, whether of their own volition or somebody else's, as appears probable. We'll probably never know for sure. This same bank building, the Milan Ambrosiano headquarters, it had a office for the man named Roberto Rason, who was shot in an assassination attempt outside those headquarters. We'll be talking about the people Abruzzati and Balducci again in just a couple of minutes.
Now, again, just to solidify, excuse me, some of these points here, lest anybody still out there, some Peter Pan devotee out there who still believes in fairies, would like to think that this is mere case of coincidence. Let's point out again that, as we detailed earlier in the broadcast, at the far end of this particular program, we've seen already, at the far end of this particular operation, in South and Central America, P2, International Fascista, and these other organizations are directing money from Italy, from places, specifically the Banco Ambrosiano, into phony dummy companies in South and Central America, where that money is being used to sponsor terrorism, to transport drugs into the United States in return for weapons. In other words, we've already seen that the far end of the P2 connections into South and Central America are actively involved in this guns and drug trade. At the other end, we have seen that the right-wing terrorists also involved with P2 are connected with the Phalangist training camps. Out of these same Phalangist operations are coming the other end of the drug smuggling. In the middle of the operation is the Banco Ambrosiano, one of the main banks that the P2 and its directors, its fascist directors, were using to finance these operations in Italy and in South and Central America, and presumably some of that money was also going to get these right-wing terrorists trained in the Phalangist training camps in Lebanon. And in the same main bank building of the Banco Ambrosiano, the headquarters for this entire Stee-Bomb operation just happens to be upstairs. Now, folks, I think even the most skeptical of you out there will have real difficulty stretching the bounds of coincidence to that extreme.
In fact, an article we're going to read in a few minutes concludes with the statement that this asks the exact phrase is too many coincidences, and one of the things that they're looking at is the subject of the article Nip's about to read you, namely a number of other intersections between the Stee-Bomb Arms for Drugs ring and the Banco Ambrosiano associations, and that meaning Roberto Calvi and people around him in the P2 nexus.
Absolutely. Now we're going to read another Jonathan Marshall translation of an article that originally appeared in Corriere della Sera, the Italian newspaper, for December 31st, 1982. It's headlined, "A Who's Who of the Italo-Turkish Drug Trade." The Turkish bosses. By the way, I should just mention, for the rest of the broadcast, Dave and I are going to be reading a lot of Turkish names. Of all the languages that we wrestle with on this broadcast, I think Turkish is probably the most difficult for us. So any native Turkish speakers or Turkic language experts in the audience, please bear with us. We're just going to try and make them consistent, and we'll spell them whenever possible, although we won't spell all of them because there's so many.
In general, when we're dealing with foreign names on a cold read here, we have to ask your indulgence.
The Turkish bosses. The last arrest warrant signed by Judge Palermo on December 22nd, 1982, concerned Ismail Oflu, age 39, international smuggler, considered the king of the Turkish underworld. He had his hand in every branch of Turkish crime, especially the traffic in drugs and guns. Oflu, O-F-L-U, was for a time a refugee in Sofia, and the Turkish police asked for his extradition for a whole series of crimes, including 3 homicides. But after a few months, his tracks were lost in Holland. To Oflu are directly tied Seal Hussein, age 40, Mustafa Kisachik, age 55, and Nahik Asan, age 60, called by Judge Palermo, quote, 3 world-class promoters of the traffic in drugs and guns who developed with a base of contacts in Sofia, Bulgaria, obviously. The 3 men are in fact heads of the 3 most powerful Turkish mafia families, which have a monopoly on the production of drugs in the Syrian border region, where the poppies are grown. All 3, besides, are friends and partners of Henry Arsan. Remember, Henry Arsan is the main man at this point at Stee-Bomb. Now they're naming some names. Salah al-Din Waqas, W-A-K-K-A-S, represented the Turkish families in Milan, was based in a luxury apartment downtown. Many were his business contacts with Arsan, and above all with Karl Koffler, Herbert Oberhofer, and Gerlando Alberti, whom he met several times in Milan. His job meaning Wacas' job, was to route the morphine base to Alberti, who would have it refined in Sicily. Now, Karl Koffler, one of those names mentioned, K-O-F-L-E-R, born in Trento, age 55, arrested December 1980 and driven into a corner. With his revelations, he will aid Judge Palermo to round up the ring that supplied Oberhofer the drugs found in his garden and in the vineyard in Bolzano. He was in contact with the brothers Kunz, K-U-N-Z, in Zurich. On March 7, 1981, he was found dead in his cell in Trento. Herbert Oberhofer, contractor and hotelier, age 40, ex-trafficker and for years a confidant and collaborator with the Guardia di Finanza, that's the finance police. And by the way, we mentioned earlier in the broadcast, I can't remember the gentleman's name now, but one of the key members of I think actually the leader of the Italian Guardia di Finanza, the finance police, was a member of P2.
Giudice was the man's name, and in fact he was appointed by a Cardinal Poletti, who had a lot to do with getting him to where he was, and we talked about that in our second program.
The day after the discovery of the drugs at Mattarello, police found in the vineyard near Bolzano the remainder of the stock, 130 kilos of pure heroin and morphine. By the way, when they say the discovery of the drugs in Mattarello, that's the original Stiebom arrest that we read you the article about from November of 82. 130 kilos of pure heroin and morphine were discovered in Oberhofer's vineyard near Bolzano. Arrested and held for several weeks, Oberhofer is now wanted. He had business ties with Kunz, Wacas, and Henry Arsène. Now, the Kunz brothers. How Albert and Hans Kunz, financiers in Zurich, they were Calvi's men, tied also to Carboni's Sofint. They were supposed to have directed in Iran a load of arms from the United States and directed by Israel, acting in close contact with Arsène. And if I remember correctly, Hans Kunz was in London meeting with Calvi the day before he was found dead.
The exact chronology of Calvi's travels just before his death, I forget, but both Kunz brothers were contacted by Calvi on, I guess you could call it Calvi's last ride.
Right, exactly. No, they were actually in London, as I recall from the stories, with Calvi. Anyway, so that's the Kunz brothers, but notice again now, the Kunz brothers in close contact with Arsène, also in close contact with Roberto Calvi, P2 member, confidant of popes, and leader, chairman of the Banco Ambrosiano. Okay, so if you need to tie that knot any tighter, there's another contact right there.
It'll be tied still tighter, but also be worth noting here what happened to Karl Koffler. He was an alleged prison suicide. He managed to commit suicide by thrusting himself through the heart with a long, sharp needle. That's another one of these very suspicious suicides in connection with this case.
Gerlando Alberti of Palermo, age 55, ex-lieutenant of Luciano Liggio. Get back to Liggio in a second. By 1980, Alberti had control over the entire traffic in drugs to the U.S. He was arrested thanks to the investigation of Boris Giuliano in connection with the discovery of the huge heroin refineries at Cinisi and Punta Raisi. In Milan, Alberti had ties to Wacas through his lieutenant, Angelo Marai. Now, Luciano Liggio was the head of Anonima Sequestri, which was a mafia kidnap gang that was also working for the right wing and involved with the strategy of tension, and what had originally begun as a program for kidnapping businessmen and holding them for ransom expanded into a program that was a part of the strategy of tension.
Now, it was through the investigation of the Anonima Sequestri with links to the mafia, to the P2, to Western intelligence. It was through this investigation that Judge Accorcio had come across the P2 Lodge and had begun investigating the P2 Lodge. Judge Accorcio was then assassinated by the aforementioned Pierluigi Conchitelli of Ordine Nuovo and Internazionale Fascista, as we looked at last week, acting at the behest of Stefano Della Chiai.
Okay. Continuing. Domenico Balducci, mafia boss, tied to Alberti, for whom he was the Roman representative of the traffic in drugs. He was a business partner of Flavio Carboni. Again, Flavio Carboni, intimate of Michele Sindona, and later partner of Roberto Calvi. Balducci was a business partner of Flavio Carboni in the Punta Volpe real estate project in Sardinia, which asked Ambrosiano for a loan of 6 billion lira. Calvi said yes, but he was blocked by his vice president Roberto Rossone, who was attacked several months later. Balducci was sought by police at the end of 1978 for having signed bank transactions of dirty money, originating in kidnappings and drugs, from which Palermo and Naples ended up in Sindona's Amancourt Bank in Switzerland. He was assassinated in Rome in front of his house on 16th of October 1981. Now, well, it's being explained right here, so I'll go ahead. Danilo Abrucciati, killed April 26, 1982 in Milan while trying to shoot Roberto Rossone. Boss of the Roman underworld, especially drugs and extortion, former member of Anonima Sequestri, again, that's the Luciano Ligio group we were just talking about, of the Marseille gang Berenguer and Bergamelli, was in business contact with Balducci and Dioto Levi, the latter of whom was a partner of Calvi and present in Zurich at the moment of Calvi's flight. With a police record and now wanted, Dioto Levi is another key man in the connection between the Roman underworld businesses tied to Sofint and the Sicilian mafia. Skipping on down, this is still,
That'll do it.
Okay.
That refers to the next story here, that note
Okay.
there. I should have crossed that out. So a couple of things to note here. Domenico Balducci and Danilo Abrucciati, as we indicated earlier, were two of the key people involved in the attempted assassination of Roberto Rossone, Banco Ambrosiano vice chairman, which took place right outside the same building where Ambrosiano was headquartered and where Stíbam was headquartered right upstairs. Now, Abrucciati affiliated with the aforementioned Anonima Sequestri, and, basically, to make a long story short, all of these people part of the whole P2 nexus. Anonima Sequestri provided the key to the discovery of P2, as mentioned just a second ago, and it's worth reviewing here. We got Balducci, Abrucciati, Gerlando Alberti, all of them affiliated with the mafia, with Anonima Sequestri, with the P2 complex, the Kunz brothers, Herbert Oberhofer and Karl Koffler. The last one, Karl Koffler, while in prison, and we're going to look at some more prison-related deaths in this whole complex. Karl Koffler managed to kill himself by thrusting himself through the heart with a long, sharp needle. Now, we're going to be taking a look at some more connections. Now, this, again, remember that hang on one second. Why don't you interpolate here a second, Nip, while I manipulate the tapes here.
Okay, again, the connections that are coming out now, okay, just to make this plain for those of you who are fairly new to this stuff, we're talking about this whole operation that we already explained as being intimately involved with the Vatican Bank, the use of the Vatican Bank apparently by Archbishop Marcinkus for not only to make money, but to make money many ways illegally, aided and abetted by Roberto Calvi and Michele Sindona. We're finding out now that these same groups that Archbishop Paul Marcinkus had the Vatican Bank involved in are not only involved in these financial scandals, which are bad enough in and of themselves, but are involved in the world's biggest fascist-oriented guns for terrorism network, Stíbam. And we've seen now the net has drawn so tight as to be inescapable. There are no more coincidences. Stíbam is a direct contact, if it's not actually a direct arm of the P2, as is the Banco Ambrosiano at this point.
And it should be noted that P2 itself involves a much, much larger context involving international fascism, Western intelligence, and the CIA and other U.S. intelligence agencies in particular. We're going to be talking about that in connection with Stíbam a little later. Still another connection between the Banco Ambrosiano P2 complex and Stíbam is carried in the following story. Again, research credit to Ted Rubenstein, translation Jonathan Marshall. This is from the Italian news magazine L'Espresso of the issue of December 12, 1982. The headline of the article is Amid Arms and Drugs Between Sofia and Brescia. Skipping down in the article, talking about Stíbam here. Arsan comes from a noble family and was in Italy for 20 years. Undisturbed in his traffic despite being known at the time to the DEA. Remember that, we're going to come back to it. His telephone began to spill important information. It made clear that the little old man had his hand in the international arms trade, but it didn't clarify where the arms left and where they ended up. That mosaic began to come together at the beginning of the year when police, listening in, learned a new name long known to them, Renato Gamba, last name Gamba. An armorer with a factory in Valtrompia in the province of Brescia, Gamba was known for his production of precious small caliber, that's valuable, it really would be a better translation, of valuable small caliber pistols and hunting rifles. Who would have ever expected someone like that to be involved in the traffic in armored cars and assault helicopters? But sure enough, one day at the beginning of summer, he left for that temple of intrigue, the Hotel Richmond in Geneva. The task assigned him by Arsan to find, for an anxiously awaiting buyer, 20 armored cars, 25 tanks, and 10 helicopters. Police intercepted calls between Gamba in Geneva and Arsan in Milan. They investigated further and found some surprises. First, in the spring of 1982, new capital came to Gamba's plant. It was sent by a Milan finance house, Brogi Izar, born as an honorable maker of pottery and silver, which transformed itself within a few months under the guidance of little-known persons, suggesting that they were figureheads acting on behalf of others. By the way, Brogi Izar is B-R-O-G-G-I. The second word is I-Z-A-R. Continuing. The new owners had the clear and long-considered idea of quickly creating a defense division, unquote, to sell arms of all types and electronic systems. They entrusted this to a foreigner, Reginald Allas, A-L-L-A-S, famous in the world of arms, who prided himself on having access to both the Pentagon and the Kremlin. He began investing money in the business to produce light arms. With difficulty, investigators penetrated this labyrinth and they discovered something else peculiar. A share, 2.3% of Brogi Izar, belonged to the Banco Ambrosiano of Roberto Calvi. He must have known that this finance house was in the business of making arms. Police then remembered another curiosity that before looked casual. Stíbom was headquartered in a building owned by Ambrosiano, where lived the former vice president of the bank, Roberto Risson. And I would interrupt, as we just looked at, his killer and the person who apparently recruited him also very much connected with the P2 complex and Stíbom. Continuing. Too many coincidences. Gamba, in search of armored cars, installed himself in the Hotel Richmond, a place frequented by another person prominent in the Calvi case, Hans Kunz, who organized the final voyage of the banker to London. He rented the plane that took him there. Kunz, officially an oil merchant, isn't only that. Last August 2nd, Iran ordered from him $50 million in war equipment. So, in the case of Henry Arsan here, one of his associates, and a person who apparently did his bidding at least certain occasions, is a man named Renato Gamba. Gamba's formerly manufactured commercial firearms, that is, valuable pistols and hunting rifles, decides to get into the military armaments business, and in so doing, he's financed or refinanced by an organization, Brogi Izar, which was described as being very, very mysterious in this article. Brogi Izar has capital participation, albeit only 2%, by the Banco Ambrosiano of Roberto Calvi, in whose headquarters building Stíbom is also headquartered. Broadcasting from Foothill College, this is KFJC Los Altos Hills.
Okay, now, excuse me, a very short section of an article here from Corriere della Sera. The motor functions are going already. It's only 9:30. From December 11th, 1982, the headline for the article as a whole is "The investigation into arms traffic are extending into Germany." They're talking again about Henry Arsan, head of Stíbom, and it says... Oh, by the way, this is again a Jonathan Marshall translation provided to us by Ted Rubenstein. "It is truly incredible how Henry Arsan, contacted by the American and Turkish secret services in 1973, known by the Italian police, continued undisturbed for 20 years under the insignia of his Milan company, Stíbom. It's not so much incredible unless you try and maintain that it's a coincidence." Again, Henry Arsan, contacted by the American and Turkish secret services in 1973, also known to Italian police for 20 years working as Stíbom in Milan. We're going to hear a little bit more about Henry Arsan, some of his connections to Western intelligence, which are rather interesting. First, however, we are going to take a short break and give you all a chance to get up and stretch, those of you who are listening all the way through. And since Dave and myself have no choice but to be listening all the way through, we're definitely ready to get up and stretch.
And we're going to stretch our minds and our vocal cords and our lips and tongues, too, which are getting taxed badly here.
That's right. See if we can develop that facility that we of course, one of the world's centers of arms shipments. I thought that might also be appropriate. And what we are talking about, of course, is so far to date the biggest guns and drugs operation yet brought to light, that being Stíbom, S-T-I-B-A-M, and that being an operation apparently directly under the control, or at least largely under the control, of those fine gentlemen at the Propaganda Due Masonic Lodge, notably people like Licio Gelli, Michele Sindona, Umberto Ortolani, Roberto Calvi, and others. And as we mentioned, Henry Arsan's main office of Stíbom, located in the Banco Ambrosiano building in Milan, that same building where once the scandals started breaking, people went flying out the window there like popcorn. We've talked about that a little bit tonight. But more importantly, again, we're talking about a vast circuit of terror, I guess you could say, starting with the drug traffic of the Middle East, most notably Turkish and Lebanese drugs, opium, heroin, antecedents, being transshipped by the Phalangists with the help of the Turkish fascist group, the Grey Wolves, into Italy, into Sicily, and processing plants there, and going thence to South and Central America, up into the United States, at which point they're exchanged for weaponry, and the reverse circuit begins. This is, of course, very important because all along the way money is being made. This is also an organization that is run entirely by right-wingers, and it seems to be being used mostly to profit right-wing organizations, right-wing political factions, and whole right-wing governments. We talked earlier about how some of the profits were probably used, one of those areas being Operation Condor, in which some of these groups, these governments in South America got together and basically developed sanction units for the elimination of their enemies. Not a new concept, but one brought to perfection by people like Stefano Della Chi and other P2 hitmen extraordinaire.
In the section that we just concluded before the break, we looked at a number of different connections between the Stibom arms for drugs ring and the P2 nexus. We looked at a part capital participation by Banco Ambrosiano in one of the key arms suppliers, and Arsan Associates, Renato Gamba. We took a look at an intersection of a lot of people, Danilo Abruzzati, Domenico Balducci, and a whole bunch of other people associated with Roberto Calvi, Flavio Carboni, and others, and their connections to Stibom. Just before the break, Nip read a short section of an article in which it basically, the statement was made that it was truly remarkable how Henry Arsan was able to continue undisturbed for nearly 20 years despite being known to the authorities. Well, during this section of the broadcast, we're going to get into some of the international connections of Stibom and the influences of some of the other people, some of the other Stibom elements beside the P2 complex that we just delineated. Again, research credit for the following story goes to Ted Rubenstein, translation Jonathan Marshall. This is from Panorama, the Italian magazine Panorama of May 9th, 1983, and it's an interview with Judge Carlo Palermo, the magistrate investigating Stibom. It quotes him as follows. The common link among the small and big traffic is Henry Arsan, a Syrian who frequently stayed in Italy and who had interests in many import-export businesses. He was involved in drugs and was at the same time a collaborator of the DEA, the American police specializing in the fight against drug trafficking. A man of 1,000 commercial ventures, never scorning the sector of arms. One of the things that we've looked at in the past on our programs, and we're going to be looking at great length in our series on organized crime, narcotics, and the intelligence community, is how the DEA and other American drug enforcement administrations have, and in fact, or agencies I should say, have in fact been used to traffic drugs as well as to quote, enforce against their distribution. And here we have Henry Arsan, according to the judge who investigated this, a collaborator of the DEA. And Nip's about to read you a short section of an article which will delineate at greater length the DEA connections of Henry Arsan.
Okay. Reading from, again, Corriere della Sera, and a short segment from an article of December 16th, 1982. On 5th of August, 1973, an agent of the DEA and a special Turkish agent made contact with Arsan. The American was Thomas Angioletti. Says a document from the Italian Interior Ministry, quote, "From that moment, Arsan collaborated with our offices in Rome and Milan, from which he obtained various permits with the help of the agent, to obtain 100 kilos of morphine base from Ismet Sil and Mustafa Cyril. It seems that Arsan played a double game, though, going from a liquor and cigarette smuggler to big-time heroin dealer." So on the 5th of August, 1973, interestingly, 1973 is the year that a lot of these things start happening. 1973, I think, is also the year that Muammar al-Gaddafi took power in Libya, and we talked about some earlier events that started in 1973. But in 1973, an American DEA agent, Thomas Angioletti, got together with Henry Arsan, and with the help of Angioletti, Arsan was able to obtain 100 kilos of morphine base. Now, 100 kilos of morphine base, when translated into heroin, I have no idea how much it would be. It would be an incredible quantity of heroin, just a mind-staggering amount.
Okay, now the DEA operations of Henry Arsan are worth keeping in mind, because now we're going to be getting into not only some American connections, but specifically connections between Stigbaum and American intelligence and national security elements. And those connections are massive. Also, we're going to hear about a name of a certain former Hollywood movie actor turned politician who's also going to crop up in connection with this series of figures. One of the main scams that Stigbaum was involved with was an apparent attempt to smuggle nuclear weapons to the Middle East and specifically Syria. An indictment involving this attempt to smuggle nuclear weapons came to light in the Santa Cruz Sentinel, among other papers, of June 6, 1984. Research credit to this to Ted Rubenstein. This is an AP story, dateline Trento, and headlined, 30 accused of trying to sell nuclear arms. And again, we're back to Stigbaum here. A state prosecutor is recommending indictments against more than 30 people for allegedly smuggling weapons and military vehicles and trying to sell nuclear weapons. Prosecutor Enrico Cavalieri said Tuesday night that he filed the recommendation with Judge Carlo Palermo, who has spent 4 years investigating the arms and drug smuggling ring. Among those listed in Cavalieri's report, according to the Italian news agency ANSA, was Rossano Brazzi, B-R-A-Z-Z-I, the Italian actor known for his movie role in South Pacific and 3 Coins in the Fountain. Cavalieri confirmed the ANSA dispatch, which quoted his report to Palermo. He said, more than 30 people were involved in a failed attempt to sell nuclear weapons to 3 unidentified Arab nations and to Argentina, but declined to give other details such as what weapons or nuclear fuel was actually sold and who produced them. ANSA said the group is also suspected of trying to sell submachine guns, tanks, helicopters, missiles, ships, plutonium, and uranium to Iraq, Taiwan, the Philippines, and Argentina. The prosecutor's recommendations are not binding and are only meant as advice for the judge, who has final say on indictments under Italian law. ANSA said Palermo filed his recommendations Monday with a Trento court, along with 300,000 pages of documents. Details of that report are covered by Italy's Official Secrets Acts. The news agency said Cavalieri's 58-page report recommended indictments for former military officers, businessmen, and several foreigners. ANSA quoted Cavalieri's report as saying Brazzi's involvement was unclear, but that he should be indicted so as to allow a more in-depth examination of his role, unquote. The actor's Rome home was searched last year on a warrant issued by Palermo. Also named in the report, according to ANSA, were Colonel Massimo Pugliese, P-U-G-L-I-E-S-E, once head of military intelligence, Italian businessman Carlo Bertoncini, and Egyptian citizen Ivan Galileos. The report said there was sufficient evidence to try all the men for criminal association. The indictment sought by Cavalieri is the latest in a long series of actions against the ring, ANSA said. Last year, 28 of its members were found guilty of having exported armored cars and helicopters to Iran and other Middle East countries in exchange for heroin that was marketed in Western Europe. They were sentenced to up to 18 years in jail. Palermo told the state-run RAI radio network last year that the ring's operations touched nearly all European countries producing arms, especially Italy, West Germany, Spain, and Britain. Quote, then there are the transit countries, among them Bulgaria, Turkey, Yugoslavia, and Greece. You could say all the countries in the Mediterranean area were involved, he told the radio. So, a couple of the points to underscore about this. We're going to talk about the nuclear arms smuggling scam, or attempt to smuggle nuclear arms, in a little bit. 2 of the key names to remember here are Rossano Brazzi, about whom we're going to talk in just a minute, and Colonel Massimo Pugliese, a former Italian intelligence chief. And as we're going to find out, Colonel Massimo Pugliese, the Italian intelligence chief, has connections with an Italian fascist organization which has an awful lot of connections to an awful lot of other Italian intelligence chiefs. We're going to take a short musical break here from the Radio Free America show number 25 that you're listening to now. In this Radio Free America show number 25, you're listening to an outtake from Radio Free America number 20, the Stigbaum show from May of 1986. We'll come back to that in 5 or 10 minutes or so after giving you all a chance to rest your thinkers and ears. Back in about 5 to 10 minutes. Number 20, actually. This is number 25. This was number 20 that we're re-airing part of. And this was originally aired on May 22nd, 1986. It deals with the arms for drugs ring Stigbaum. We will pick up where we left off. By the way, there is a certain degree of overlap between cassette sides. So if you hear a little bit of repetition, it just means we've changed cassettes here, and might give you an opportunity to do the same if you haven't already done it without losing any text. Back to Radio Free America show number 25, reprising part of Radio Free America number 20.
That's right, and one of the places where it comes up and it's mentioned in the book In God's Name by David Yallop, which we've been using quite a bit during this series of broadcasts, is during 1982, at the time of the Falklands War. And originally, Licio Gelli was attempting to get Exocet missiles for Argentina. Bear in mind, Argentina's strong contacts, the Argentine military's strong contacts to the P2 and to Italian fascists, when we're thinking about these things. Licio Gelli was doing his best to get Exocet missiles to the Argentinian military from France. And this first operation fell through, and then Yallop writes about the second one. In August 1982, he writes, the Argentinian junta secretly decided to recommence hostilities against the British forces guarding the Falklands. They felt that with more Exocets, they could win the war and the islands. This time, Gelli dealt with a former officer of the Italian Secret Service, Colonel Massimo Pugliese, a member of P2. Again, British intelligence learned of the proposed deal. The British took steps to ensure that the deal fell through. So Colonel Massimo Pugliese, a member of P2, also indicted in the Stee-Bomb case, involved apparently in the same case with Rossano Brazzi, and as we will find out as we're going along, involved in an attempt to sell some weapons of some extreme magnitude to Syria, apparently. We'll talk about that more. But notice again, Licio Gelli, the connection to the Argentinian military junta, the P2 connections, and once again also, of course, most importantly for our purposes, the connections of the P2 to Stee-Bomb.
Okay, and remember the DEA connection of Arsan, and because we're going to be getting into some foreign intelligence connections here right now. Rossano Brazzi is the name we want to look at right now, and specifically we're going to look at Brazzi's connections to a couple of American presidents, Ronald Reagan and Richard Nixon. The first of the articles we're going to be looking at comes from the Corriere della Sera of June 4th, 1983. Again, researched by Ted Rubenstein, translated by Jonathan Marshall. Italian film star Rossano Brazzi, 65, gray-haired now, was the Latin lover of the cinema. Interrogated by Carlo Palermo because of his ties with people in the guns for drugs trade. What brought him to Palermo's attention was his recent friendship with General Giuseppe Santavito, ex-chief of the Military Secret Service, CISMI, involved with P2. His ties with Colonel Massimo Pugliese, also of the Secret Service, arrested on orders of the Trento magistrate. Pugliese had just returned from Alta Coma, where he participated in the funeral of King Umberto. Brazzi is a personal friend of Ronald Reagan and a friend of Richard Nixon. Nothing strange, then, that the president of Somalia invited him officially, along with Santavito, to his country for economic advice. Brazzi knows the top American financiers and could be of help. So before we go on to the next article, Rossano Brazzi is a good friend of Ronald Reagan's. Now recall that Licio Gelli of P2 had performed a valuable service for Ronald Reagan on 2 counts, getting him good publicity in the Italian press, and perhaps even more importantly than that, through the auspices of the P2-controlled Super Sismi and Francesco Pazienza and Michael Ledeen, as we looked at in our last program. The Licio Gelli, again, through the Super Sismi group Pazienza and Ledeen, was able to help get damaging information about Billy Carter, specifically talking about Billy Carter's connections with Muammar Gaddafi of Libya, who in turn has, obviously, as we've looked at, many connections to the P2 complex in and of himself. However, the damaging information published in the New Republic and one other publication, I forget offhand, was instrumental in helping to assure a Reagan victory. And as I said, Licio Gelli also generated favorable publicity for Reagan in Italy. And quite probably as a result of those 2 events, Licio Gelli was a guest of honor at Ronald Reagan's inauguration in 1981. So when we have Brazzi, the Stee-Bomb linked and through Stee-Bomb P2 linked actor being a friend of Reagan's, it's worth taking note of. Also, Brazzi is a friend of Richard Nixon. The connections between the Nixon administration and the P2 complex through Michele Sindona, among others, we looked at in programs 2 and 3. And another name to take note of in this article is Giuseppe Santavito, key person in the Super Sismi group within Italian intelligence, key P2 member, and Santavito, along with fellow P2er and fellow Italian intelligence veteran Massimo Pugliese, involved with Rossano Brazzi, apparently, in some of these machinations. Second article, we're going to bring in some of these same connections, and we're going to mention a very familiar name, in addition to Ronald Reagan and Richard Nixon. From Panorama of the May 16, 1983, we find the following. A Sicilian doctor named Gregorio, close to Brazzi, decided to name himself Grand Master of the Sovereign Order of New Aragon, founded according to him by the Visigoths in AD 718. His idea was to conquer the island of Barbuda in the Caribbean with 1,150 inhabitants. As sidekick, he recruited his friend of 15 years, Brazzi. Bratzi says his old friend, Frank Sinatra, introduced him to Reagan in 1948. The two men went in on the project with Massimo Pugliese, whom Bratzi met in 1974 when the ex-SID official approached him to do a documentary on Sacrosindone. CBS 60 Minutes did a show called Return of the Visigoths on the new Aragon movement. Dean Rusk and Tom Watson seem to have been involved. So some more big American names coming in surfacing in connection with Rossano Bratzi, Massimo Pugliese, and some of the key Stee-Bomb performers. Not only Ronald Reagan and Richard Nixon, both American presidents with connections to the P2 complexes as we looked at, but also Frank Sinatra, and possibly also former Secretary of State Dean Rusk as well.
Now, the 60 Minutes program referred to the return of the Visigoths suggested that although the people involved, and Rossano Bratzi was one of the people interviewed, although the people involved were suggesting that they just basically wanted this island of Barbuda just to be their kind of home for their particular sort of Catholic-oriented organization, that in fact what it was probably being looked at as was an offshore tax haven, and in fact Robert Vesco had been in the area sometime just before Rossano Bratzi and these others, looking at Barbuda for exactly those purposes, an offshore tax haven. Remember, that is very important in these huge arms and drugs operations because these places, since they are not subject to the income taxes of countries like the United States, France or Italy or whatever, it's much easier to hide their doings from government officials, honest government officials.
Broadcasting from Foothill College, this is KFJC Los Altos Hills, and in keeping in mind Reagan, Nixon, Frank Sinatra, Dean Rusk, Rossano Bratzi, Pugliese, Santavito, and the people we've been talking about, we're going to begin getting still further into the American connections to Stee-Bomb, and we're going to begin by taking a look at a guy named Garth Reynolds.
That's right, and talking about your offshore arms and tax haven, we're going to be talking about the ultimate in the offshore tax haven. This is an article from the Sunday Times of London. The article is written by Robin Morgan, Anthony Terry, and Dalbert Hallenstein. Came out on the issue of December 5th, 1982. Its headline, Dealers Tout Arms in Floating Bazaars. This article was supplied to us by Ted Rubenstein. The article itself, we're going to skip the beginning, but it's talking about basically international arms dealers who are using tramp steamers to set up huge floating arms bazaars. That's B-A-Z-A-A-R, bazaars, and using those as a offshore arms dealerships. And one of them they're talking about in particular is an American by the name of Garth Reynolds, who had at that time steamed into London and had supplied a catalog listing all the things that he had for sale. The article talks a little bit about Reynolds' background. Reynolds surfaced briefly in Los Angeles in 1980 when customs officers arrested him on currency charges, but he disappeared once more. He has since been linked to a 71-year-old Syrian arms dealer, Henry Arsan. Arsan was arrested 2 weeks ago at his home in Varese, northern Italy, on illegal arms trade charges after a 2-year investigation. A search of his office uncovered copies of telex messages dated December 12th, 1981, offering a list of arms almost identical with the Reynolds wares. The arms were similarly stored aboard ship in Genoa, with identical conditions of sale. In addition to the helicopters and rockets, Arsan had added 10 German-built Leopard tanks and, quote, thousands of Soviet-made Kalashnikov rifles, unquote, a total package worth 138 million pounds. Let me just cut in parenthetically here to mention that one of the most important things for us to remember is when we're talking about things like the strategy of tension and we're talking about journalistic disinformation by people like Claire Sterling, one of the ways that they usually try and tie these terrorist acts to the left is to point out that a lot of them are committed with Soviet weapons or Soviet bloc weaponry. Well, notice here that Henry Arsan, an arms dealer tied directly to fascist terrorists, has got himself hundreds of thousands of Soviet-made Kalashnikov rifles, and in just a moment we'll find out how these weapons get into the hands of these people. Sources in the arms trade and Italian police believe the helicopters and tanks did not exist. They were used as bait to attract big-spending arms buyers in the hopes of selling the huge batches of infantry weapons, a classic ruse in black market arms deals. Other telexes dated as recently as 2 months ago were found in Arsan's files, offering further shipments of arms aboard ships in Italian ports. Such vast amounts of illegal weapons have begun to appear on the black market only in the past 2 years. At first, they came from Libya and other Arab countries eager to offload surplus Soviet arms. But more recently, arms caches in Lebanon left behind by the Palestinian evacuation have flooded the market. So we have essentially a lot of these Soviet-made weapons are coming from Libya and coming from Lebanon, being put onto the international market by people like Henry Arsan and Garth Reynolds, this American, who is tied to Arsan.
Now, one of the interesting things about that article that Nip just read you was Garth Reynolds' presence in Los Angeles. Now, his presence in Los Angeles in connection with the Stee-Bomb ring is not at all surprising, and particularly in light of the following article. Again, research credit to Ted Rubenstein, translation for Jonathan Marshall. This is from the French magazine Le Point of March 14th, 1983. Asim Akaya, brother of a police inspector in Ankara, was charged by him to reveal to Italian authorities the existence of a vast traffic in arms and heroin beginning in Turkey, transiting through Bulgaria for rallying near Trento, a city near Venice. Milan police took the case to Judge Carlo Palermo on November 22nd, 1979. No one knows why Akaya told his story, but it was incredible. Heavy trucks, TIR, that's the name of the manufacturer, loaded up with heroin in Turkey or light arms in Syria, for terrorists, and dropped their loads in Trento for distribution throughout Italy, Austria, West Germany, Britain, and even France. In the reverse route, cargoes of arms left Los Angeles for points around the world. Carabinieri invaded the Hotel Carinal belonging to Carlo Koffler. By the way, I would add that Carlo Koffler was the Stee-Bomb associate who wound up committing suicide by thrusting a large needle through his own heart in prison, like so many other people who die in prison. Beginning that sentence again. Carabinieri invaded the Hotel Carinal belonging to Carlo Koffler, the home of butcher Giorgio Malone, the villa of Herbert Oberhofer in Bolzano. They discovered 140 kilos of heroin. They found drugs in Verona and Trieste. Akaya's information was exact. 220 people were arrested. 3 of the most important names proved to be Henri Arsan, 70, Mehmet Kantas, C-A-N-T-A-S, 46, a Turk, shipper with a company called Sutas in Los Angeles, and Bekir Çelenk, C-E-L-E-N-K, drug trafficking Turk based in Sofia. I'm going to read those 3 names again because they're very important, in particular Bekir Çelenk. 3 of the most important names, and this again we're talking about Stee-Bomb, proved to be Henri Arsan, 70, Mehmet Kantas, 46, a Turk shipper with a company called Sutas in Los Angeles, and Bekir Çelenk, drug trafficking Turk based in Sofia. Akaya has disappeared. Executed? That is a question mark there. Arsan cracked under interrogation. He said the guns for drugs traffic had been going on for 20 years. He admitted that he was in charge of recycling the billions and laundering the dollars. I would interrupt, perhaps that's what the proximity to Ambrosiano was for. He also produced figures on arms trade, around 300 tanks and nearly as many helicopters salvaged from Vietnam. He spoke of arms deliveries to Khomeini. Kantas escaped ahead of American police and made it to Zurich, where his shipping company has headquarters. He denies touching drugs. That was Bekir Çelenk's job. So the main points here are that the Stee-Bomb Arms for Drugs ring had a major branch originating in Los Angeles, where we saw Garth Reynolds, an American connected with the ring, surfacing in the last article that Nip read you. Now, in Los Angeles, a man named Mehmet Kantas, another Turk, is basically running the show out of a shipping company called Sutas, based in Zurich, Switzerland. And perhaps the most important name here for our purposes, and bear in mind that we're gravitating towards the shooting of Pope John Paul II, is Bekir Çelenk, described as a drug trafficking Turk based in Sofia. Recall the fascist Grey Wolves and Mehmet Ali Ajah's participation in that group and their connection to narcotics trafficking originating in Turkey and quite possibly the Abdi Ipeki murder. Because Bekir Çelenk is one of the key figures in the supposed Bulgarian connection of the plot to shoot the Pope. So again, Arsan and all the P2 and Western connections. Arsan himself, a DEA agent. So with Rossano Brazzi, we have connections to Nixon, Reagan, Frank Sinatra, as well as P2 members Pugliese and Santovito. Now we're moving to the United States. We have a major branch of this company in Los Angeles, and Bekir Çelenk one of the key figures from the Pope shooting plot, one of the top 3 people in Stibom.
And also, as mentioned, like Mehmet Ali Agha, connected to the Grey Wolves' drug trafficking in the Middle East. I'm going to read an article from the San Jose Mercury for December 23rd, 1982. The headline is Italian Warrant Links Drug Ring Attack on Pope. This is the Los Angeles Times Wire story, Dateline Rome. An arrest warrant alleging arms and drug trafficking was issued Wednesday for Bekir Çelenk, a Turk suspected of aiding Turkish terrorist Mehmet Ali Agha in his attempt to assassinate Pope John Paul II on May 13th, 1981. The warrant, issued in the northern Italian city of Trento, was the first time that the alleged arms ring was publicly linked to one of the alleged plotters against the Pope. In Trento, state prosecutor Carlo Palermo said that warrants had been issued for Çelenk and a Turkish associate named Ismail Oflu in connection with the smuggling ring. Meanwhile, the trial of an Italian couple charged with espionage in Bulgaria began in Sofia Wednesday, with a postponement at the request of the defendants, according to the official Bulgarian news agency BTA. Italian police last month broke up what they said was, quote, the largest world organization of illegal arms traffic, operating in Bulgaria, Italy, West Germany, and Turkey, selling large quantities of arms to mainly Middle East buyers in exchange for heroin. Bulgaria is, quote, a principal contact point, unquote, in arms and drug traffic, Italian Justice Minister Clelio Darida said Monday. Çelenk, who is reported under detention in Sofia, and the Bulgarian Secret Service have been linked to the papal assassination attempt by Rome investigating magistrate Ilario Martella. Well, we're going to be talking more about this so-called Bulgarian connection. But again, note, at this point, as we begin to close in on the closer innermost circle of the Mediterranean merry-go-round, and note these direct connections, we have Mehmet Ali Agha, the assassin, the would-be assassin of the Pope, working with the fascist Grey Wolves and working with their drug smuggling, presumably. The fascist Grey Wolves involved with drug smuggling, Mehmet Ali Agha, a member of that group. Bekir Çelenk, who, as we're going to find out, is connected not only to Mehmet Ali Agha, but to the Grey Wolves themselves. Bekir Çelenk also is involved with Mehmet Ali Agha, and in fact helps him to get the gun that he uses to attempt to shoot John Paul II.
Actually, the Agha himself, although Agha changed his story, identified Bekir Çelenk, we'll talk about this next time, as the paymaster for the plot. Supposedly he paid several million marks. It's more than a minor pointer, not to pick nits, but according to Agha, this is the man who paid him. This is the paymaster for the whole Bulgarian plot. As we've seen, he's one of the top 3 men in an explicitly fascist-link arms for drugs ring with connections to American intelligence that we're going to be developing, whose associates intersect with American presidents for about the last 20 years and things of that kind. And so this is the paymaster here. We'll be talking about that next time.
Good point. I'm glad you made that correction. Okay,
the person who got him the gun is interesting, too. We'll be going into that
That's
as well.
right. Yes. We're going to get to them in a moment. Well, actually, next week, mostly. Okay. But again, Mehmet Ali Agha, directly linked through both his organization and through the operation itself and the payment rendered by Bekir Çelenk. Bekir Çelenk, a member of Stibom, International Guns for Drugs organization, inextricably linked with P2, as we have seen, as well as American intelligence for the purposes right now, inextricably linked with P2, and in fact, apparently laundering the money through the offices that they shared with the Banco Ambrosiano of Milan. P2 and the Banco Ambrosiano of Milan directly linked into the Vatican Bank. And the bodyguard of John Paul II, the man who was shot at, Archbishop Paul Marcinkus, head of the Vatican Bank, collaborator with Michele Sindona and Roberto Calvi in all these financial affairs, many of which coincide or intersect directly with Stibom. So we have basically a very short connected chain of about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 places directly between Mehmet Ali Agha and Archbishop Paul Marcinkus, the Pope's bodyguard, and the head of the Vatican Bank. On the other hand, as we will see later on, the chain of very dismal circumstantial evidence attempting to paint a case for the Bulgarian thesis is so convoluted as to be almost inconceivable how anybody could even try and pass it off in the first place, let alone have the success with it they did. Bear in mind, as we're going into this stuff later on, this direct an incontrovertible chain of evidence between Mehmet Ali Agha and the Vatican itself, a very short, very, very impressively sturdy chain.
And remember also, something we'll be developing at much greater length next week, and we'll be encountering here in a few minutes, the Western intelligence connections to Stibom. One branch of it originates in Los Angeles, the Sutas Shipping Company, and Bekir Chelenk, the reputed paymaster, and we'll be talking about this next week, the reputed paymaster of the Pope shooting plot is one of the top 3 officials in the Stibom Arms for Drugs ring. As we're going to look at, he also is affiliated with the Grey Wolves, the fascist Turkish, basically the fascist party of Turkey, or the youth wing of it. Research credit for the following story again goes to Ted Rubenstein. He got this from The Guardian, formerly the Manchester Guardian. I say that to distinguish it from an American leftist publication called The Guardian. But Ted got this from the Manchester Guardian of November 29th, 1982. It's from The Guardian's correspondent in Rome, George Armstrong, and headlined, Agha to confront accused Bulgar. Only going to read a couple of short sections. Skipping down. A Turkish author and journalist, Mr. Ugur Mumcu, we're coming back to him later in next week's broadcast, widely regarded in Ankara as the country's most knowledgeable person on the Turkish underground outside the police, said he had learned without doubt that Bekir Chelenk, one of those whose name is on the international warrant, had met Agha in the Vitosha Hotel in Sofia between July 10th and 12th, 1980. He said that Chelenk was using a false passport in the name of Nakati Çelik, and stayed in room 1078 while Agha stayed in room 911. Mr. Mumcu stated that Chelenk and Oral Çelik, the other man wanted in Italy, were, like Agha, members of the extreme right-wing group known as the Grey Wolves and had fled Turkey after the military coup in 1980. So Bekir Chelenk, according to this information, which in turn quotes Ugur Mumcu, generally considered, as mentioned here, not only the country's top expert on the underground, but an extension of that underground, specifically considered Turkey's top terrorism researcher. And according to Mumcu, Bekir Chelenk is a member of the fascist Grey Wolves, along with Mehmet Ali Agha. And Çelenk's key position in the Stibom Arms for Drugs ring, worth remembering in that context. Now, another possible connection between Stibom and the shooting of the Pope is mentioned in the same Guardian article of November 29th, 1982. It's a mysterious connection, unresolved, but one which will make more sense later in the broadcast. The Italians would also like to question a Gerard Donovan, known also as J. Douziar, D-O-U-Z-I-A-R, who holds an Australian and Iranian passport. He was last seen in Rome in spring of last year, and in his haste to leave, he left a large amount of money behind in a safe deposit box. They believe he may have been involved in the attempt on the Pope's life and in the giant drug and arms smuggling ring which has been discovered in northern Italy, which included Bulgarian and Turkish connections. So another interesting possible connection between Stibom and the Pope shooting, an Australian known as Gerard Donovan, who carries Australian and Iranian passports and who goes also under the name of J. Douziar. As we're going to see, well, we've already looked at the Iranian connections that was mentioned in the Le Point article of, and in several of the articles actually, of Stibom involvement with arms to Iran. It's worth noting here the Australian passport. That's going to make much more sense later in the program.
Okay, going to read a very short segment from a Washington Post article of December 8th, 1982. The headline, 3 Bulgarians linked to shooting of the Pope. The article is written by Sari Gilbert as a special to the Post. And it's just a short segment here. It says, one name mentioned in reports on the smuggling network, that smuggling network, of course, being Stibom, is that of Abuzer Ugurlu, U-G-U-R-L-U, a major Turkish criminal who reportedly met Agha in Bulgaria and was named in U.S. media reports as a key link between Agha and the Bulgarians. Martella, that's Judge Ilario Martella, flew to Ankara to question Ugurlu, who, the magistrate said in an interview earlier this fall, denied any involvement in the assassination attempt.
Okay, so the definite connection between the supposed Bulgarian thesis and basically, before we're getting into the Bulgarian thesis, the definite connection between Stibom and the plot against the Pope is Bekir Chelenk, a fellow Grey Wolf, according to the top Turkish expert on the subject of Mehmet Ali Agha. The Grey Wolves very much involved in the narcotics traffic originating in considerable measure in Turkey. And Bekir Chelenk is the paymaster for this proposed plot. 2 other names, interestingly enough, the aforementioned Abuzer Ugurlu, Also, a mysterious Australian named Gerard Donovan, also who holds a passport, Jay Duzier. We'll take a look at a possible Australian connection here. In fact, a definite Australian connection. Well, in a couple of articles that we're about to get into right now. Now, one of the most important aspects of Stigbaum, one which obviously has been implied to a certain extent by the fact that Henry R. Sand is a DEA agent of long standing, bought drugs, in fact, morphine-based from the DEA, with the many interesting American connections. Rossano Brazzi's connections to Sinatra, Reagan, and Nixon, the link-up between Garth Reynolds and the Stigbaum Arms for Drugs ring, and the fact, of course, that one key branch of that ring originated in Los Angeles. What we're going to be looking at now specifically is the massive, massive intersection of Western intelligence, specifically American intelligence, with the Stigbaum Arms for Drugs ring. And remember that one of its key figures, reportedly the paymaster, in the plot to shoot the Pope. Research credit for the following articles also goes to Ted Rubenstein, and translation, once again, to Jonathan Marshall, editorial page editor of the Tribune. The following three articles are from the French newspaper Le Matin. And the first of the articles, it was a three-part series on 3 successive days in 1984. The first of the Le Matin articles that we're going to be looking at comes from Le Matin of June 20th, 1984. It's an article headlined Bargain Bombs, and it was authored by the Le Matin Italian correspondent Fabrizio Calvi, no relation as far as we know. And Bargain Bombs reads as follows. And remember now, all of the P2 connections and the connection to the Pope shooting that we've spoken about. On June 4th, the public prosecutor of Trento, a little-known town in the north of Italy, asked the indictment of 30 individuals. He possessed an enormous dossier, the fruit of 4 years of inquiry in the 4 corners of the world. Among those implicated, 5 persons who served as intermediaries for the sale of 3 20-megaton bombs to Syria. Le Matin investigated for 3 months to trace this thread. The dossier is composed of 300,000 pages. Stacked together, they constitute a pile more than 100 meters high. So, interrupting, the documentation upon which, for those people who might be inclined to turn up their nose at this, the documentation upon which this is based, if the papers were stacked on top of each other, would be higher than a football field stood on its end. So, continuing. In this mass are 2 sheets of paper where one can read 3 atomic bombs. Read, quote, 3 atomic bombs. Weight, 90 kilograms. Enriched uranium, 40 kilograms, U-235, power 20 megatons TNT. Dimensions, 41 inches by 11 inches. The whole is covered with a case of lead for reasons of security and can be used only from an airplane. Delivery should take place in the country of the buyer. The 3 can be assembled now and will be ready for delivery 6 weeks later after dispersing 60% of the payment. The net price for the 3 is $924 American.
$924 million.
$924 million American, excuse me.
That's a bargain. Yeah.
They are indeed bargain bombs. Thanks for the correction. If I need similar assistance, please provide it, because again, at some point you're going to blow one of these with all this reading.
Right.
First phase of the operation. An RWA, a letter of cautioning, engaging the responsibility of a leading bank, will be effectuated for the totality of the sum under the code name GEM in the face of the Trade Development Bank of Luxembourg, Telex 2621, telephone 41893. Attention, Glauco Partel Pass HO 63381. Remember the name Glauco Partel. Key name here. Second phase of the operation. Again, still quoting from the documents here. A reunion at a place between the buyer and the seller at TBB. If the buyer isn't satisfied, he takes back the RWA and goes. If he is satisfied, he addresses to Glauco Partel, P-A-R-T-E-L, a letter of credit confirmed irrevocable, transferable, and divisible under the code GEM. This letter authorizes the withdrawal of 60% of its value as deposit. Before this happens, the buyer sends 3 experts, no more, to the factory of the seller, where they will follow all the phases of production which last 6 weeks. Third phase. Once the 3 bombs are completed and tested, they will be shipped in exchange for payment of the 40% remaining. From this sale are excluded Israel and South Africa, unquote. Now, this is not a quote from the documents, but continuing with the text from Le Matin, on June 6th, all newspapers subscribing to the French press agency received on their telex the following dispatch, quote, Italy Arms. An investigation over 4 years by Judge Carlo Palermo into an enormous international traffic in arms, including atomic bombs, ended with the indictment of 30 persons. The indictment included notably the actor Rossano Brazzi, interrupting friend of Nixon and Reagan, Colonel Massimo Pugliese, ex-member of the Italian Secret Service, and 4 other Italians who would also have acted as intermediaries in the sale of 3 atomic bombs to Arab countries. Many materials were destined for Iraq, such as hundreds of tanks, nearly 34 grams of plutonium, 1,000 kilograms of uranium, SAM-7 missiles, 500 Kalashnikov submachine guns, etc. No details were given as to the foreigners figuring among the 30 persons indicted. Henry Arsan, the Syrian businessman considered the brains of the traffic, died last year in prison in Milan. Repeating that last sentence. Henry Arsan, the Syrian businessman considered the brains of the traffic, died last year in prison in Milan. And I would interrupt again to say, add Arsan to the long and growing list of prison casualties which result when the investigations of these various P2-related scams begin. Continuing. The 4 other Italians mentioned were Glauco Partel, Carlo Bertoncini, Vincenzo Giovanelli, and Ivan Galileos. Certainly, Carlo Palermo, that basically concludes that section. So before we continue, 3 atomic bombs were going to be shipped to unnamed Middle Eastern countries. Possibility of Syria will be discussed later on, but it's worth noting here that as we get into the American intelligence connections, that the leader of this ring, Henry Arsan, after his arrest, dies in prison conveniently before any of the cases that he's connected with can come up in court.
Continuing with the Le Matin article a little further down. In any case, the 5 principal indictees, in other words, the folks indicted, are stars of the arms traffic milieu. The most famous is Glauco Partel. This Roman engineer, specializing in the fabrication of missiles, directs the Center for Research on Missile Propulsion in Rome, a private institute. When Judge Palermo, interrogated him, Partel admitted that for the last 15 years, he worked for the National Security Agency. That's the U.S. National Security Agency, which employs 200,000 agents. And if it is less talked about than the CIA, it is no less effective. Partel, moreover, isn't lacking for sponsors. In 1981, during the Falklands War, he participated in a formidable operation on behalf of British intelligence for the befuddlement of the Argentine services. In Paris, he proposed to the captain of the vessel Alfredo Corti, chief of the Naval Air Mission of the Argentine ambassador, the sale of 24 Exocet missiles. The Argentine jumped at the chance. The Exocets were never delivered. They never existed. The captain was repatriated on the double. I should just mention here, it's interesting that what this story actually is, we're not quite sure at this point. But here on one end of this thing, we've got Licio Gelli and Massimo Pugliese. Massimo Pugliese already connected to Steebohm, trying to put together a sale of Exocet missiles. On the other hand, in this article, they're suggesting that Glauco Partel was working on behalf of Britain to pretend there would be a sale of Exocet missiles, which in fact there wouldn't be. So a story that needs to be a little further investigated.
One possibility is that the U.S. and Britain were cooperating in the Falklands War, a fact which drew a lot of anger from the Argentines.
Yes, indeed.
And remember, Partel is working by his own admission for the National Security Agency for 15 years.
Continuing. So the intermediary in the A-bomb affair had a charged past. But so did the seller himself. Eugene Bartholomeus was installed in the Australian city of Sydney and had already done business with Partel, selling him tanks and helicopters. He told his client that it all came from CIA surplus arms stores. In 1980, Bartholomeus was mixed up in the Nugan Hand bank scandal. I'll get back to that in a second. Eugene Bartholomeus and his companion Edwin Wilson, since convicted in the United States, were implicated in the illicit sale of arms to Libya. He was also tied to mafia families in Los Angeles, and he maintained excellent relations with an Australian of Chinese origin, Dennis Wong, suspected of being a crime syndicate director in Sydney. But this time, it seemed, Eugene Bartholomeus hit the jackpot. It was more than a question of ultra-modern tanks, helicopters, or frigates. What he proposed was nothing less than the sale of 3 nuclear devices. The telexes don't indicate where they were to be assembled. We don't know if the Americans mounted this operation to intimidate Israel and South Africa, excluded as buyers of the bombs. Partel, after all, was a specialist in deception, as shown by his role with the Exocets.
In any case, the Roman engineer, that's Glauco Partel still, explained that he contacted representatives of the Syrian government who were very interested in the purchase. The negotiations began shortly thereafter. A telex seized by Judge Palermo from Partel's office reads, quote, arrived, negotiator-seller in Amsterdam Wednesday, 27th of January. After contact will follow to Luxembourg. Okay, bunch of important things to look at here in this article. Okay, we're talking about Glauco Partel now, who by his own admission says that he is working for the NSA, the National Security Agency, the top secret United States intelligence agency that works almost exclusively with intelligence gleaned from electronic sources and other sources of that sort. A huge organization, very secretive. Glauco Partel also apparently involved somehow in the Exocet missile deal going on or not going on in the Argentine Falklands War. Now, the Falklands War come in a variety of ways into this whole operation, not only because of the fact of the strong connections between the P2 and the Italian P2 and the Argentine P2, but also, as we will talk about next week, because of the involvement of certain other people at that time, and the involvement of people like Michael Ledeen involved in the Pope shooting with Alexander Haig, some speculation that we have there, things of that nature. A bunch of things to look at in terms of the Falklands.
Broadcasting from Foothill College, this is KFJC Los Altos Hills.
Partel's involvement there, something to be checked into. Now, involved with Partel in the sale of the A-bombs, for which Pugliese and Rossano Brazzi and the others are indicted, Eugene Bartholomeus. Bartholomeus, with a very interesting background, involved in the Nugenhan Bank scandal. Now, the Nugenhan Bank, for those of you who have not been following these broadcasts long enough to remember, the Nugenhan Bank was an intelligence bank, okay, that was put together out of the...
It was put together, actually, it was a joint CIA and naval intelligence operation. The naval intelligence group involved here was called Task Force 157. And a couple of key names to remember in connection with Task Force 157, Henry Kissinger and the aforementioned Edwin Wilson. We'll be going into that in our series on organized crime, intelligence, and narcotics. We touched on it briefly in Radio Free America 4 when we were talking about the Turple-Wilson connection.
Anyway, the Nugenhan Bank, a very interesting bank for a variety of reasons. The Nugenhan Bank was primarily an intelligence bank. There were a lot of CIA operations being run through the bank, with the bank as a cover for laundering of money in the drug traffic and the weapons traffic, and also for direct CIA political operations. When one of the bank's founders was found dead in the Australian outback, government agents descended on the bank, forced the employees to stay in there all night long shredding documents, and told any of them that if they said a word about what had happened, that their families would be killed. These are U.S. military and intelligence officers telling this to bank employees, according to several different accounts. Anyway, the Nugenhan Bank, as Dave mentioned, linked to Task Force 157, Henry Kissinger, and Ed Wilson. Ed Wilson, of course, also involved very heavily with Muammar Gaddafi, with Frank Turple and Gary George Corcola, who we're going to talk about in a little while. We have Bartholomeus now tied into the whole thing. So we have a whole separate little side loop going with Libya. We've got Libya involved with the Italian fascists. We've got Libya involved with people like Otto Skorzeny, ex-Nazis. We've got Muammar Gaddafi involved in supporting the International Fascista, which is operating all over Latin America. We've got Libya also involved in the arms trade in terms of offloading Soviet-made weapons like the Kalashnikovs and others, and getting those into the Stee-bomb circuit. And now we also have them involved through people like Eugene Bartholomeus and Ed Wilson, involved with Stee-bomb and this particular sale of, or would-be sale of atomic weapons to Syria. So there's a whole little side thing going with Muammar al-Gaddafi, who, as we mentioned earlier, is the quote-unquote idol of the Avanguardia Nazionale people, who are linked to Licio Gelli and the P2, and who claim that Hitler, Mao, and Muammar Gaddafi are their shining stars. So Gaddafi apparently involved in this whole thing, and as we'll see in the Pope shooting in general, up to his neck. And as mentioned before, Frank Turple, who claimed to have trained Mehmet Ali Agha how to use a gun, at the time he was doing that, was also working for, definitely working for Muammar Muammar al-Gaddafi, and almost as definitely working at the same time for the American CIA.
We'll be talking about Turple and some of the connecting links between him and this whole plot again next week. But perhaps for our purposes here, the most important things to remember is the American connection. The Los Angeles-based branch SUTAS, the connections to Reagan, Nixon, Frank Sinatra, Dean Rusk, the Glauco Partel, of course, being one of the key. Well, Henry Arsan himself, who dies in prison, is working for DEA. Glauco Partel is working for the National Security Agency, and as we've seen, one of his key associates in the A-bomb scam was Eugene Bartholomeus, who not only worked for CIA, but specifically was an associate of Edwin Wilson's in the Gaddafi, basically the CIA operation in Libya, whereby Gaddafi's terrorists were trained and armed. We're going to take a short musical break. We'll come right back with Radio Free America number 25, reprising a couple of hours of Radio Free America number 20. We're reprising part of Radio Free America number 20, then we'll go live again for about the last half hour of the show. Again, remember the American intelligence connections, SUTAS, Arsan, Bartholomeus, and Partel's connections to American intelligence front and center here, because, again, one of the other top dogs, and I use the term advisedly, in Stiebom was Bakir Chelenk, affiliated with the Grey Wolves and reputedly the paymaster for the plot to shoot the Pope. The next day, that is to say the day following the article that Nip just read you, the second part in this Le Matin series appeared about Stiebom. This is from Le Matin of June 21st, 1984, and it's headlined On the Track of the Leopard by Fabrizio Calvi. By the way, the Leopard referred to here is the Leopard tank, a West German heavy tank. Beginning with the article. Eugene Bartholomeus escaped the curiosity of the Australian police. His companions in the CIA protected him well, and it is they who put him in contact with the Roman engineer Glauco Partel, the man who took it upon himself to find clients for the devices. I'm going to read that last couple sentences again. Eugene Bartholomeus escaped the curiosity of the Australian police. His companions in the CIA protected him well, and it is they who put him in contact with the Roman engineer Glauco Partel, the man who took it upon himself to find clients for the devices. The Italian, as he explained to Carlo Palermo, who indicted him last year, had just quit his work at SAI, where he was occupied fabricating missiles. He didn't yet know what he was going to do. It was then that he received at his Rome office a telex proposing that he sell a lot of 66 Cobra helicopters, which the Americans couldn't sell in Iran because of the change of regime. The engineer told the judge, quote, "The helicopters were in an airport in Belgium ready for delivery. The finances had to pass through the Credit Bank of Anvers, but I wasn't able to find buyers, and the helicopters were recently destroyed during NATO maneuvers," unquote. The first setback didn't break the confidence of Bartholomeus or the Americans. Partel continued. One of his accomplices, Carlo Bertoncini, an Italian industrialist from Pomaccia, told the judge how, in October of 1982, he negotiated with the Roman engineer to sell 116 tanks and 20 helicopters to the Somalian president, Siad Barre. When he received the two men in his office on 17th of October 1982, the African chief of state specified that he had asked his services to check with Washington on the credentials of Partel. He explained that he had obtained all the necessary guarantees. Moreover, the sale went through. And Judge Palermo has in his dossier a copy of the contract signed by Glauco Partel and the Somalian Minister of Finances. And when the magistrate asked the engineer where his arms came from, he replied, "The Americans," unquote. Ex-agent of the National Security Agency, reseller of arms from the CIA, the missile expert explained to the Trento judge why the American intelligence services wanted at all cost to sell their surplus. Quote, "The market in arms is divided into two categories: official sales of one government to another on the one hand, and more discreet transactions on the other, which bring in, with government blessing, a series of intermediaries. Beyond its discretion, the second system presents an advantage. It permits the circulation of bribes." I would interrupt. Recall that bribing and blackmail are one of the major devices that P2 uses to enhance its power. Continuing. For its private transactions, the American government demands three conditions: evidence of funds, approval of the State Department, and a purchase order on the part of the acquiring government. For private sales, one makes use of separate accounts directed by persons such as Eugene Bartholomeus or one named Jenny Bende, B-E-N-D-E. They have the formal function of reseller and avail themselves of intermediaries, always with the approval of secret services, unquote. Reading that last sentence again. They have the formal function of reseller and avail themselves of intermediaries, always with the approval of secret services, unquote. Partel was one of these intermediaries. He was able to establish contacts with an impressive number of governments, and the diagram of his organization that he made for Judge Palermo shows that he could intervene throughout the world. Carlo Bertoncini handled relations with Iraq and Iran. Vincenzo Giovinelli with Israeli and Arab contacts. The lawyer Campagna dealt with China. A certain Dutcher, D-U-T-C-H-E-R, was also in touch with China, but also with Saudi Arabia as well. And Marshall adds in parentheses here, this must be John Dutcher, Triple's contact, and quotes the Jack Anderson column of November 13th, 1981. So another probable link here between Steebaum Arms for Drugs ring and the Triple Wilson CIA team. So that is a very, very important connection, the Dutcher connection. Reviewing this section very briefly, what we've looked at so far, Partel has basically said that Steebaum was used as a major organ of the American government, not only for unloading its surplus arms, but for basically compromising people who were incorporated as intermediaries in some of these sales. And the massive American involvement here, according to Partel, himself a national security agent, is not surprising in light of the fact that the head of this ring was a DEA agent. Bartholomeus is working for CIA and a major branch originating in L.A.
Continuing with the article. The purchasing central functioned as effectively. Glauco Partel reserved for himself negotiations with the principal furnisher, the American State Department. Reuting, R-E-U-T-I-N-G, and the armorer Krateros talked with the Federal Republic of Germany. That's West Germany, of course. Bartholomeus occupied himself with Britain and the Commonwealth countries on the one hand, and countries fabricating Soviet arms, like Korea, on the other. Richard Eschbach handled ties with the French. Partel was also in contact with an impressive number of foreign countries, specialized in the importation and export of arms. One of these brings us directly to the Nugan Bank of Sydney, the financial facade of the CIA for the international, for the arms traffic. Let me read that sentence again. One of these brings us directly to the Nugan Bank of Sydney, financial facade for the CIA for arms traffic. That which interests us is the French affiliate of Commerce International, headquartered in Cagnes-sur-Mer, a little town in the Maritime Alps on the Côte d'Azur. Since 1981, this company has officially renounced the sale of arms, none of which prevented in 1982 it receiving from an Indian general an order for thousands of cartridges. The company that directs this officer asked Glauco Partel for a reference. According to the British review Private Eye, during the Falklands War, the head of Commerce International, or Commerce International, Frank Craddock, sold Argentina a lot of munitions similar to those requested by the Indians. Frank Craddock is of British nationality. His unpatriotic gesture was not appreciated on the other side of the channel. Still, according to Private Eye, he fled to Great Britain, where he was sought for bankruptcy fraud. Frank Craddock was tied to the arms trafficker Sarkis Sognalian, installed in Miami, where he directed an arms network for the CIA. Commerce International is a multinational company having affiliates in, among other places, Washington, Brussels, Cagnes-sur-Mer, and Singapore. According to Mother Jones magazine, it was an emanation of the CIA. In Australia, journalists for the National Times affirmed that it was implicated not only in arms trafficking, but also in shadow operations directed by Nugan, apparently for the CIA, the destabilization of the Whitlam government in 1975. We just cut in to explain. That was the government of Prime Minister Gough Whitlam, a labor government not sympathetic to some of the things the CIA was involved in, specifically, among others, the use of the Pine Gap Station. The Gough Whitlam government was actually destabilized. Again, we're talking just like with Italy, was destabilized effectively, an ally by the United States CIA, because we did not approve of their attitude towards the CIA's operation in their own country. That was something Nugan was used for as a conduit for funds. Judge Palermo's researches weren't confined to the Western countries. In following the path of a lot of Leopard tanks, he stuck his nose into the Middle East. Among all the arms sold by Partel and his friends, Palermo also found tanks theoretically reserved to the NATO countries that were offered to Iraq and Iran. It has been years since people in Europe spoke of a traffic of this type in tanks fabricated by the FRG. Again, that's West Germany. There were rumors of a sale to Libya, but there was no proof until Palermo found evidence of even more disquieting transactions. The sale of leopards had been negotiated by Glauco Partel. Who was the seller? Palermo asked. Quote, "It was a man named Reuting," Partel replied. "He was officially based in the Federal Republic of Germany and was occupied in import-export. He must be allied with the Federal Services," meaning with West German Federal Intelligence. Reuting put himself in contact with us through Eugene Bartholomeus when the latter was proposing to us to sell the 66 helicopters I told you about, unquote. To whom were the tanks offered? To Renato Gamba, proprietor of a small arms factory in the valley of Trompia, in the north of Italy, not far from Trento. It wasn't so much the personality of Gamba that held the most surprises for Judge Palermo as the men with whom he was in contact and for whose account he realized these transactions. Carlo Palermo had just quit the world of CIA vendors, of the Eugene Bartholomeuses, to enter the no less troubling universe of Middle Eastern buyers allied to the Syrian services, and directed by the astonishing Henry Arsène.
So basically, what we have here is an operation which appears to be primarily revolving around two organizations, one of them, the P2 and the related Banco Ambrosiano connections, the other being Western Intelligence. Not only Arsène, but also Partel, Bartholomeus, are working for elements of U.S. intelligence and or law enforcement, and according to Glauco Partel, many of the operations of Stigbaum were undertaken at the instigation of the U.S. government. So we have a massive American intelligence connection to Stigbaum here, in light of the fact that part of it originates in Los Angeles. That's not all that surprising. And remember now that there are a number of links, the main one being Bekir Çelenk, between this arms for drugs ring and the shooting of Pope John Paul II.
Absolutely.
Also worth remembering, Renato Gamba here, remember, was the person, part of whose arms factory was financed by Brugge Izar. Part of Brugge Izar is owned by Ambrosiano.
All right, we're going to take another break at this point, and we will be back in just a few moments. The man who's going to sell you the stuff that you need, and the Trans-Global Express. And it all adds up together here, folks, because we are talking about the world's largest guns for drugs and terrorism network, Stigbaum. Originally, we were talking about it only in terms of the context of the Italian politics and the right-wing politics of the Italian P2, Propaganda Due Masonic Lodge, essentially a secret fascist government of Italy that was discovered and exposed in 1981. But that not only that, but as we've been talking about in the last part of the broadcast, the fact that Stigbaum is intimately connected to a variety of United States intelligence operations, most notably the CIA, the Nugan Bank of Australia, and the Task Force 157 operations out there.
National Security Agency
through Glauco Partel, the man who set up the sale of 3 atomic bombs to Syria, and of course the operations of Frank Turpel and Ed Wilson, erstwhile quote-unquote ex-CIA agents in Libya who worked with Muammar Gaddafi and, according to Frank Turpel, also trained Mehmet Ali Ajah, the would-be assassin of Pope John Paul II.
Now, that really is the key aspect of Stigbaum, is the fact that one of the key 3 people in that organization, Bekir Çelenk, was reportedly the paymaster for the plot to shoot the Pope. And again, that with the massive connections between Western intelligence and the Stigbaum ring, with the massive connections between the P2 and Ambrosiano complex and the Stigbaum ring, calls seriously into question the so-called Bulgarian connection. We're basically going to blow that connection out of the water next week. Returning now to the series that Le Matin did about Stigbaum, we're going to take a look at some Stigbaum operations here which go behind the Iron Curtain. Recall that there was a reference to Bulgaria and Yugoslavia as being transit countries. There were also some Stigbaum dealings behind the Iron Curtain. Returning once again to Le Matin, this one from June 22nd, 1984. And again, translation, Jonathan Marshall, research credit to Ted Rubenstein. Speaking of some of the Turkish associates of Henry Arsène, DEA agent and head of Stigbaum, Le Matin and Fabrizio Calvi write as follows. One of the Turkish traffickers arrested was Tegmen Erdem, E-R-D-E-M, the first to explain to Palermo all the mechanisms of this contraband organization. In the past, Erdem had already furnished these same details to a DEA agent based in West Germany. The Turk claimed, moreover, to be himself an agent of the DEA, and claimed that his agency number was SXY 2000. Quote, I knew Arsan in 1982 in the United States, unquote, Erdem explained to the judge. We were in California in the company of Mehmet Kantas. We had a reunion where Arsan recalled the sale of hundreds of Leopard 2 tanks and Cobra helicopters. Arsan also told us that he negotiated the sale of 50 or so M48 tanks. They were in Hamburg, supposed to be sent to their destination through a Danish port. When Arsan realized this, he billed the cost of transport based on the value of the Spanish port, When Arsan realized this, he billed the cost of transport based on the value of the boat charged with convoying the arms. He told us then that Renato Gamba furnished the arms. In July of 1982, Tegmen Erdem did his first deal with Arsan and discovered the Syrian ramifications of the arms traffic. Arsan also served as intermediary between the Polish government and that of South Yemen to sell 56 tons of arms, 5,000 Kalashnikovs and 5,000 Tokarevs. But why did the Polish government use Arsan? Why did Arsan supply the Polish government with false documents attesting that the arms were destined for the Emirate of Qatar? Erdem got the response from Arsan's mouth. Quote, they explained that they didn't want the Soviets to know about the operations, so they wouldn't get a percentage. The Poles had a pressing liquidity problem. The deal brought them $1,800,000. Still, according to Tegmen Erdem, the first negotiations of which he was a part took place at the seat of the Polish ambassador in Vienna. Besides Arsan, the Polish delegation was composed of a functionary from the Defense Ministry named Andrzej Urbaniak, Urbaniac. The sellers represented by Arsan. Tegmen Erdem and 2 Syrians associated with Arsan. Those 2 were named Abu Daoud, called George, and Mustafa Zenedin. Remember Abu Daoud, we're going to come back to him in a future broadcast some months down the line. For our purposes here, it should be noted not only that still another associate of Arsan, Tegmen Erdem, claims to be a DEA agent and even cited his number, but it's worth noting here that Arsan has dealings behind the so-called Iron Curtain, specifically in Poland, and the operations of Stigbaum behind the Iron Curtain would be of obvious interest, and obviously could quite obviously be used as a vehicle by Western intelligence.
Okay, continuing, as Dave mentioned earlier, to the connections of these various agents and their connections specifically behind Iron Curtain countries, we're going to read from an article that was originally published in the San Jose Mercury of March 24th, 1983. The headline is, NBC says CIA agents under investigation. Dateline New York, AP Wire story. The Reagan administration is investigating whether the CIA station chief in Rome and 2 of his agents disobeyed orders in connection with the investigation of the shooting of Pope John Paul II, NBC News reported Wednesday. The 3, whom the network by law did not identify, raised the ire of officials in Washington because they refused to stop, quote, discrediting the so-called Bulgarian connection in the inquiry of the papal shooting, NBC said. Mehmet Ali Aja, a Turkish gunman serving a life sentence for the attempted assassination of the Pope on May 13, 1981, has told Italian investigators that several Bulgarians helped him plan the attack. Quoting an unidentified key administration source, NBC said the 3 may be fired because they have allegedly disobeyed orders issued by the National Security Advisor William Clark and CIA Director William Casey. NBC said the Rome agents may have downplayed the Bulgarian connection because they did not want attention drawn to, 1, an alleged close working relationship, unquote, between them and an Italian labor leader who was arrested as a Bulgarian spy. We'll get back to that. 2, the possible use of a guns and drugs smuggling route between Sofia, Bulgaria, and Milan, Italy, to run CIA agents into Eastern Europe. Okay, 2 very intriguing things there. The last 2 things mentioned that supposedly would be the reasons that these CIA agents would be downplaying the Bulgarian connection and that would be upsetting the Reagan administration. The first, the reference to an alleged close working relationship between the CIA and an Italian labor leader who was arrested as a Bulgarian spy. The man they're referring to here is a man by the name of Luigi Scricciolo, spelled Scricciolo. Luigi Scricciolo we will be talking about at some length next week. Luigi Scricciolo is interestingly involved with Michael Ledeen, and through Michael Ledeen, possibly with Alexander Haig, is also involved with one of Mehmet Ali Agha's stories, like the Bulgarian connection, but it was one of the first of Mehmet Ali Agha's stories to fall apart under scrutiny, and will perhaps lead us in considering how it fell apart and where, to looking a little more closely into where Mehmet Ali Agha's stories come from in the first place. The second part, and for more useful for our purposes right in this show, because we'll get to Scricciolo next week, the possible use of a gun and drug smuggling route, obviously the Stibom route, between Sofia, Bulgaria, and Milan, Italy. Well, the idea that it's being used to run CIA agents into Eastern Europe is quite interesting. There is quite possibly some involvement by some level of the Bulgarian government in this operation, if nothing else. Just as in the American government, there are undoubtedly elements of the Bulgarian government that are quite corrupt enough to set up little money-making operations on their own, and to utilize their positions to put away private nest eggs.
Also, a couple of things to consider also is the fact that Bulgaria fought on the side of the Axis in World War II, and it's not unreasonable to suppose there might be some residual fascist elements in Bulgaria. Beyond that, too, there's always the very, very murky consideration of counterintelligence. In other words, spy versus spy, something we generally try to stay away from when we can. But a number of researchers that we've spoken with share the view that we have, which is that both sides knew what was going on with Stibom and were using this arms for drugs ring to help monitor the other's activities. Now, one of the aspects one of the things to consider in connection with the obvious involvement of U.S. intelligence with Stibom is the possibility of using that organization in order to obtain East Bloc guns for whatever purpose. Just exactly that suggestion was made in an issue of the Reader's Digest, specifically in the issue of November 1983, in an article about Stibom, but blaming the whole thing on the KGB in Bulgaria, in an article about Stibom by a man named Nathan Adams. The title of the article is Drugs for Guns. It's all about Stibom and basically makes the whole thing out to be a commie plot, which, as we've seen, is a massive exaggeration in light of all the P2 in the P2 connections, the fact that it was headed up by a DEA agent and had all kinds of other U.S. intelligence connections. Interestingly enough, in this article, Drugs for Guns, Adams admits that the CIA was involved with the Stibom ring to a certain extent. He writes, incredibly enough, Western nations, perhaps unwittingly, have actually contributed to the conspiracy. For example, until recently, the CIA, via a German broker, was purchasing millions of dollars of Eastern Bloc weapons to equip anti-Sandinista guerrillas in Nicaragua. The weapons were supplied by Kintex. So according to Nathan Adams, Stibom was used to obtain AK-47s for the Contras in Nicaragua. And that may, in fact, be a pattern which is continuing to this day.
Indeed. And bear in mind, too, now, again, we don't have to examine every single one of these in a whole lot of detail, but it should be looked at this way. As Dave mentioned, one of the possible reasons for these connections between the CIA and their conduit into the Stibom operation would be, as Dave mentioned, a way to get Eastern European weaponry for whatever purposes they might desire. Now, one of the things that has been going on, for instance, on the Nicaraguan border, is that the Contras have been attempting, in some cases, or it has been alleged that they have attempted to make it look as though the Sandinistas were making raids into Honduran and Costa Rican territory. There have been times when the Sandinista government has admitted, yes, we made this attack on a Contra base. There have been other times when the Sandinistas have said, no, we did not do that. But what has been proffered as evidence on the behalf of the Contras to prove that the Sandinistas did it were bodies, corpses, which don't talk, and Eastern European Soviet bloc weapons. Now, if indeed AK-47s and the like are being shipped through the CIA from Stibom to the Contras in Nicaragua, it's very possible that they could be used for just this sort of provocation with exactly the same kind of motives as were being used by the Italian fascists during the strategy of tension days.
Exactly. And there are indications that this Bulgarian AK-47 connection may be continuous to this day in spite of the interdiction of the Stibom arms for drugs ring. In witness to that, we cite the following. This from the San Jose Mercury of September 1st, 1985. Its Datelight's headline, Nicaraguan rebels get Polish rifles, U.S. says. Nicaraguan resistance forces recently received a shipment of 10,000 Polish-made AK-47 rifles as part of a weapons deal worth an estimated $6 million, U.S. officials say. According to one official, the shipment was sent from the Bulgarian port of Burgas, B-U-R-G-A-S, and reached the resistance forces via a Latin American country hostile to the leftist Sandinista government. The country was not identified. So the Polish and Bulgarian AK-47 connection may be continuous to this day. We've seen Stiebom transiting through Bulgaria and dealing with Poland in the past.
Radio Free.
All right, and we are now back live. And for those of you who just tuned in or are a little confused, since we have some better tape quality, that's a recent broadcast comparatively, May of '86. It may be a little confusing because the tape quality is good enough it's hard to tell sometimes if it's live or not. That, of course, as mentioned when we started this whole long tape segment, was taped from the Mediterranean Merry-Go-Round series that we did in May of 1986. This, of course, is Nip Tuck speaking with Dave Emory in the studios here at KFJC with Radio Free America, and we're just about into the, well, we are very definitely into the final segment of the broadcast tonight, and we're going to wrap it up. But first, we're going to talk a little bit about the segment that we just heard, and a little bit about Stiebom. And as those of you out there, you alert listeners, and I know that you are just that, cannot have failed to notice the last couple of articles and the tightening up of the focus on, in fact, the Contra connection or the apparent Contra connection to the Stiebom operation.
Well, not only was the Stiebom operation used, at least according to an article in the Reader's Digest, which in turn is very close to the CIA, used to get Polish-made AK-47s to the Contras, but the Stiebom Arms for Drugs ring was also used, as indicated in a number of different articles, for getting arms to Khomeini's regime in Iran. Now that, of course, is very, very reminiscent of the Contragate-Iran-Gate, which is currently exploding all over the American and world political scene. For those people who eventually hear this broadcast via tape, we're doing this on December 3rd of 1986. Contragate-Iran-Gate is reaching a mounting crescendo. Two of the central aspects of that involve the U.S. basically selling arms to Khomeini's Iran, using the proceeds from those sales, at least in part, to finance the Contras in Nicaragua. Now, some of the central points with Stiebom, as we looked at in particular in the second of the Fabrizio Calvi articles, we looked at basically a number of different connections between Stiebom and U.S. intelligence, and according to Glauco Partel, by his own admission, an agent for the National Security Agency, the Stiebom operation was largely an extension of the U.S. government itself. Basically, as he indicated, it was a back channel of the American intelligence services and State Department, used not only for trafficking arms, but for creating political influence in some of the countries those arms are moved to, through the circulation of bribes. Some of the key connections here and similarities between Stiebom and the Contragate-Iran-Gate that is breaking, and that we're going to be covering on Sunday night in another archive show for about 3 hours on One Step Beyond. First of all, the link up between the U.S. national security establishment and Stiebom. It were not only ties of CIA and NSA, but also the head of the Stiebom Arms for Drugs ring he was himself an agent for the Drug Enforcement Administration. DEA's intersection with CIA we're going to talk about in the third part of our program next month. Now, the connections to Iran, obviously, are very, very similar. The connections to Contras are very, very similar. And it's also worth noting, of course, that, again, this is a criminal enterprise in which the proceeds from drug traffic are used to finance the arms trade. It's also worth noting that Stiebom involves the manipulation of Swiss banks, too. Much of the financing done through Swiss banks. That is also the case with Contragate-Iran-Gate. Note in particular the intersection between the aforementioned Nugan Bank and people associated with Stiebom. Eugene Bartholomeus, Wilson Associate, Nugan Bank Associate, and obviously in light of the discussion of Nugan at the beginning of the broadcast, it's pretty easy to see some of the comparisons between Stiebom and Nugan. And again, we went into Stiebom this evening because, although it has not been established, there are indications that Stiebom and Iran-Gate, Contragate may in fact be directly hooked up. It is, as we say, food for thought and grounds for further research. This Sunday on One Step Beyond from 8 o'clock to 11 o'clock, we're going to be dealing with Contragate-Iran-Gate. The tapes of that show will be on permanent file at DAVCOR for people who eventually hear this broadcast via tape.
Now, one of the reasons that we're stressing this so strongly and that we are bringing in these connections to old cases that we have talked about, although in many instances of these cases are still ongoing. Certainly, Stiebom has never been fully documented and explored to the extent because it was apparently, if not the largest, certainly one of the largest arms and drug rings ever. But one of the reasons that we are spending the time to go back over these cases, even though it's in some instances we have not yet made these connections, is because, first of all, the connections that seem apparent to us or seem implicit are the same seemingly implicit connections or are similar to the ones that were in fact in place with Iran-Gate and Contra-Gate, which we have been talking about for several years. Of course, we did not coin this term, but we were talking about these particular gun and arms routes and these illegal funding operations and have been doing so for a long time. In a similar way, the connections between Stiebom and these things, while not proved yet, are very similar types of connections. In other words, they go beyond coincidence, and the only thing really remaining is to find a few nails that will finally nail the coffin lid down. Now, again, to reiterate, there's some very interesting connections and some cases that may have to be reopened. And, of course, this is probably one of the reasons that everybody at the White House is running around busily sticking knives into each other's back, because when this blows open, it's going to be very, very wide.
Of course, we looked at the fact that a major player in the Stiebom operation was Rossano Brazzi, a good personal friend of Ronald Reagan's. Of course, Reagan is the name that everybody is wondering about in connection with Contra-Gate, Iran-Gate. How much did he know?
Indeed. Now, one of the things that Dave mentioned, of course, was the connections between the NSA and Stiebom. One of the main connections, of course, was a man by the name of Glauco Partel, operated out of Los Angeles, a company apparently explicitly designed to illegally ship arms by the name of Sutas. Glauco Partel was also a National Security Council operative. Glauco Partel was connected also to Bartholomeus, and through Bartholomeus to Edwin Wilson.
The key name now with regard to Sutas, Mehmet Kantas, the fellow we looked at operating out of L.A., a major branch of Stiebom, the reverse route, as it was described in the Le Point article, coming out of Los Angeles.
That's right. So we have, within domestic American connections to this illegal arms trade that are not just the Wilson ones, but again, this Mehmet Kantas and Sutas connection, others. We have Ed Wilson, who is currently doing time in federal prison, a whole lot of time, for the same type of thing that other people now are who have been arrested for shipping arms to Iran are saying they were set up, they were working for George Bush. Ed Wilson maintained, and we have long agreed that he is probably correct, that he was also working for the CIA in his various operations, including the large-scale operations of taking weaponry and training materials and also training expertise to Muammar Gaddafi in Libya. Now, this is significant for a variety of reasons, but the most obvious one are the obvious parallels between the Iran case, in which, after years of protesting that how they would never do business with terrorists, and that, in fact, that they were combating terrorism worldwide, it's been now revealed the Reagan administration, in fact, did business with Iran and had secret back channels. Well, we have been maintaining for years that the Reagan administration has secret back channels to Libya and have been doing business with them. And Ed Wilson did that business while working very closely with CIA officers, and he is now in jail. So it is quite possible that one of the other things the Reagan administration is desperately trying to shelve up the defenses on is that if the Iran-Gate case blows open, that in fact we may have a Libya-Gate to go with it.
And as we've seen in some of our discussions on One Step Beyond, and as we're going to examine during the One Step Beyond show coming up on Sunday that will go into the permanent archives, the same players that we've seen in Iran-Gate and Contra-Gate are largely the same team we saw it with Turple Wilson. Names like Thomas Kleins, Theodore Shackley, Richard Secord, a fellow named Albert Hakim, a new player on the Turple Wilson stage. These are names that are cropping up with regard to both Iran-Gate and Contra-Gate, and of course, as we've seen, both of those scandals turned out to be two different sides of the same unfortunate coin.
Now, one of the other major names that has cropped up in regard to the Contras repeatedly, and in fact has cropped up on our broadcast here many, many times, is that of Major General John Singlaub. John Singlaub has a right-wing pedigree as long as your arm, dating back to when he was in charge of the forces in Korea and was booted out by Jimmy Carter for basically making undemocratic comments about the president's right to command the troops in the field as commander-in-chief, rather similar to another right-winger of note, General MacArthur, who was booted out for saying the same types of things in Korea. John Singlaub, of course, also is extensively connected with
the World Anti-Communist League, and the John Birch Society, and Ronald Reagan's National Security Council. And we talked in this earlier broadcast how John Singlaub himself went directly to Ronald Reagan and got marching orders to set up this underground covert operation to get arms and things into the Contras in Nicaragua. And one of the ways this was done, of course, we now find out was the Iran-Gate monies being brought over. But now this underground network that Singlaub tapped into, as we will see, is a network that has been long in existence and has been holding a lot of other major players. And Singlaub himself has been connected, and now we're going to introduce a few more names with Singlaub.
Now, one of the major names that we should come to familiarize ourselves with regard to the interrelationship between the arms and drug trade, and in turn the CIA's sponsorship of both arms and drugs in under the auspices of official U.S. government operations. Now, one of the names that we should know in connection with this is a guy named Robert Vesco, a fellow who's been connected with a number of scandals in the past, and as it turns out, one of the scandals that he should have been connected with has not been, at least in terms of most of the mainstream press, concerns drug smuggling. That drug smuggling on behalf, apparently, of the United States government or in cahoots with it, and in turn, the interrelationship, as we've seen so often, between drug smuggling and arms smuggling. And one of the names that we're going to look at in connection with Robert Vesco is a fellow named Mitchell Werbel.
Indeed. We're going to read now again from The Great Heroin Coup by Henrik Kruger. And this is from a chapter entitled Guns for Drugs, which in fact is our theme tonight, as you can tell. In August 1976, Lucien Conein, C-O-N-E-I-N, Lucien Conein's chum, Mitch Werbel III, whose B.R. Fox Company had shared a Washington office with Conein's DEA Special Operations Group, was brought before a Miami federal court on charges of conspiracy to smuggle 50,000 pounds of marijuana a month from Colombia to the United States. He and several co-conspirators had allegedly hatched the plot in the summer of 1975, just when Alberto Cecilia Falcón, and I will put that in parenthetically, this is the series of articles that we read a little earlier in the broadcast, just when Alberto Cecilia Falcón was arrested in Mexico. Multi-ton marijuana loads were to have been flown from Colombia to an isolated ranch in the Florida Everglades near the cow town of Okeechobee. The star prosecution witness was one of Werbel's close associates, the convicted cocaine and marijuana smuggler Kenneth Gordon Bernstein. However, weeks before his scheduled court appearance, he died in the mysterious crash of his P-51 Mustang at an air show. Most of the vital tape recordings and films of meetings between Bernstein and Werbel and other defendants were no longer producible in court. Werbel's defense was that his role in the plot had been as undercover agent for Conein. Both Conein and Eagle Crow, by the way, was a Nixon staffer, if you don't remember, who was one of the casualties of the Watergate affair. Both Conein and Eagle Crow were to have been witnesses on his behalf, but Crow testified that he didn't know Werbel had worked for the DEA's Special Operations Branch, and Conein wasn't called at all. Another defense witness was the soldier of fortune Jerry Hemming, whose private army of Cuban exiles and Americans, the International Penetration Force, appears, from Hemming's description of its missions, to have played an active role in Operation 40. During the trial, Hemming would stay late into the night in Werbel's hotel room. Werbel was found innocent and released, just like the Thai opium smuggler / CIA agent Puttaporn Kramkwan before him in 1973. He went home to Georgia to pursue his weapons business in a law enforcement training camp. According to writer Hank Messick, in 1978 he was involved in far-right politics with the likes of Major General John K. Singlaub, who had been relieved of his command in Korea after outspoken criticism of President Carter, and members of the American Security Council, the key U.S. link to the far-right's international umbrella organization, the World Anti-Communist League, dubbed WACL. As reported recently in the New York Times, the beneficiaries of his anti-terrorist training have included members of the far-right anti-Semitic U.S. Labor Party, another significant group.
It's, by the way, run by Lyndon LaRouche, right. A name that's familiar with all of us.
Werbel owns 8 companies, most of them dealing in firearms used by law enforcement and intelligence units. One of the firms studies in the operational negation of insurgents and counter-subversion, otherwise known by its acronym psionics, specializes in the production of M10 and M11 silenced machine pistols.
The latter two weapons, designed by Gordon Ingram and Werbel, are about the ultimate weapons for terror and extermination. Their sales agent was Werbel's Military Armament Corporation. Together with the anti-Castro Cuban arms dealers Anselmo Allegro and the mercenary Jerry Hemming, Werbel founded the Parabellum Corporation in 1971 in Miami. Parabellum was licensed to sell arms in Latin America. It was also the firm from which Watergate burglar Frank Sturgis planned to obtain weapons for Cuban exiles who were going to, but eventually did not, disrupt the 1972 Miami presidential conventions.
Continuing with Kruger's account. In 1974, Werbel, according to a motion filed by his own lawyer when Werbel, his son, and his company Defense Services Incorporated were charged with illicit weapon sales, was involved in a, quote, conspiracy among the CIA, Robert Vesco, and various corporations to finance clandestine guerrilla activities in Latin America, unquote. Vesco wanted to purchase Werbel's stock of 2,000 silenced M10 machine pistols. When Werbel failed to secure an export license, he devised a plan to smuggle the weapons to Vesco. The two later negotiated the construction of a factory in Costa Rica, which would be licensed to fabricate the pistols. Intriguingly, in that same period, someone was negotiating with a U.S. firm for rights to fabricate, in Mexico, fully automatic weapons for clandestine guerrilla actions in Latin America. That someone was Mexico's Cuban exile heroin czar Alberto Cecilia Falcón, and among the weapons he was inspecting was the Ingram M10 9mm Parabellum. Although the M10 and M11 could be acquired legally only with the special permission of U.S. officials, large numbers of silenced M10s turned up in the hands of European fascist terrorists in 1976 and 7. When Pierluigi Concutelli, a leader of the Italian terrorist group Ordine Nuovo, was arrested in Rome in February of 1977. Why don't you continue reading here, Nip?
Okay. When Pierluigi Concutelli, a leader of the Italian terrorist group Ordine Nuovo, was arrested in Rome in February of 1977, police found in his apartment the silenced M10, which he had used to murder the Rome magistrate Vittorio Occorsio. Occorsio had been shot down on the streets of Rome in July 1976 after announcing he would expose the close collaboration between fascist terror groups and the mafia. However, it was among Spanish terrorists, in particular, that Werbel's machine pistols appeared in quantity. Most notably, a sizable consignment of M10s, sent to Spain under license from U.S. authorities, had been purchased by the Spanish intelligence agency DGS, which has allegedly coordinated the actions of fascist terrorists. The fugitive iOS billionaire Vesco, of course, Robert Vesco again, employed a large contingent of Cuban exiles in his Costa Rica sanctuary. Moreover, his weapons negotiations coincided with the efforts of the fanatic anti-Castro Cuban leader Orlando Bosch to assemble Cuban exile groups into an army of terror, CORU, C-O-R-U, that would later carry out assassinations and other dirty work for several Latin American regimes. During Bosch's 1974-75 drive, a wave of murder struck Miami's Cuban exile haven. Most victims had been opposed to Bosch. With the obstacles to his plan removed, CORU was established in June. With the obstacles to his plan removed, CORU was established in June 1976. While Vesco and Werbel were hatching their weapons deal, Bosch's base of operation just happened to be Vesco's Kingdom of Costa Rica. And Mafia heroin boss Santo Traficante Jr. was also reportedly there between January 1974 and the summer of 75. Journalist Jim Hogan speculates in his book Spooks that the three might have joined forces in a CIA conspiracy to escalate anti-communist terror in Latin America.
Continuing. In 1973, some of the details began to surface in a series of scandals linking these individuals, that is to say, interrupting Santo Traficante, Mitch Werbel, and Robert Vesco. There are a lot of names in this chapter, so those are the three to keep track of here. Again, in 1973, some of the details began to surface in a series of scandals linking these individuals. DEA undercover agent Frank Peroff charged Vesco with financing extensive heroin smuggling. For his initiative, Peroff was fired summarily and his life was threatened. Before the Senate Investigation Subcommittee could probe deeply, the case was squelched through the intervention of the White House. The Oval Office had already helped Vesco, a friend of the Nixon family, in his run-in with the Securities and Exchange Commission,
which had sought his prosecution for the trail of swindle he had left in the world of international finance. Midway through the subcommittee investigation of the heroin charges, the DEA announced the disappearance of its Vesco file. 1 year later, as the subcommittee investigated Werbel's weapons deal with Vesco, it learned that Vesco had once employed government narcotics agents. In 1972, 2 bugging specialists from the BNDD flew from Los Angeles to New Jersey to sweep Vesco's home and office of surveillance devices. According to the subcommittee, the sweeping tour had been arranged by an admitted friend of Vesco's, who was also involved in supplying the fugitive with 2,000 machine guns and helping him establish a factory for the weapons in Costa Rica. Guess who? And interjecting, of course, the guess who they're talking about is Mitch Werbel. That was not the last heard of Robert Vesco in connection with drugs. In the summer of 1977, police uncovered the smuggling of large quantities of heroin and cocaine to Rhode Island. In one of the involved ships, they discovered a ledger in which it was written, quote, "To Vesco, $6 million he picked up with Shrimper Lansky, courier beaten up." Several things point to Vesco involvement in the long-standing partnership of the CIA, the Lansky Traficante Syndicate, and the Cuban exiles in a drugs for guns for terror deal to step up armed suppression and anti-communism in Latin America. Journalist Hogan ventures that the conspirators might have used such go-betweens and couriers as the beautiful Patricia Richardson Martinson. According to her ex-husband, the former Army intelligence agent William Spector, Ms. Martinson had very close relationships with almost everyone of importance in the drug business. Youssef Beydas, the Lebanese founder and managing director of Intrabank, known as one of the major financiers of the heroin traffic. Paul Louis Weiler, W-E-I-L-L-E-R, a French financier similarly alleged to be behind the narcotics trade. Eduardo Barudi, B-A-R-O-U-D-I, a big-time heroin and gun smuggler suspected of having arranged Beydas's mysterious death in Switzerland. Christian Beauserge David, Conrad Bouchard, B-O-U-C-H-A-R-D, a top heroin trafficker heavily involved in Frank Peroff's Vesco heroin allegations, and Marcel Boucan, B-O-U-C-A-N, the skipper of the Caprice du Temps, which was seized in 1972 with 425 kilos of pure heroin.
Continuing. Yet another likely intermediary among the apparent conspirators is the CIA contract agent / arms dealer / art dealer Fernand Legros. In 1971, the CIA helped get Vesco released from Saint Antoine prison in Geneva, where he had been arrested in the Bernard Kornfeld Investors Overseas Service case. Legros was in that same prison, and spoke with Vesco. In January 1973, the two were reunited in Nassau. Legros was seen in the company of Beydas in Geneva and Rio de Janeiro. His closest friend was the convicted heroin trafficker André Labaye, a close associate of Haiti's Duvalier dynasty. In Geneva, Legros also met frequently with Eveline Hirsch, the wife of the imprisoned bankroller André Hirsch, whose South American heroin contact had been Christian David. Just as the U.S. put the screws on the Paraguayan government for the extradition of Auguste Ricord, Legros was in Paraguay to close out a weapons deal with President Stroessner. Later, when Legros was placed in protective confinement in Brazil, newspapers speculated on his involvement in the David mob's narcotics deals. Recent years' investigations into the CIA organized crime connection have resulted in an epidemic of sudden deaths. In the CIA, DEA, Vesco syndicate scheme alone, one can mention Kenny Bernstein, Werbel associate Colonel Robert F. Bayard, who was shot down in an Atlanta parking lot in July 75, another Werbel associate and co-defendant in his marijuana case, John Nardi, who was shot in Cleveland, and Vesco's security chief, Bobby Hall, who was shot to death in his Los Angeles home in July 1976. After the Senate investigation, subcommittee's attempted probe into the Vesco heroin case was sabotaged from the highest quarters, committee chairman Henry Jackson asked, quote, "Did the U.S. government wish to keep Vesco out of this country for some reason? Did he have some special information which he could supply to explain, in part, the national nightmare we have just lived through?" One Senate investigator offered an answer, quote, "More than any single person, Vesco has information which, if he talked, would make Watergate look like a picnic."
Now, the point is here that
Mitchell Warbell, when he was arrested for arms smuggling, as he was arrested earlier for alleged drug smuggling, said that basically he was involved in a cooperative effort with Robert Vesco and the CIA to finance anti-communist activities in Latin America. As indicated here, Robert Vesco was very much involved with attempting to manufacture Mitch Warbell's automatic weapons in Costa Rica, and Robert Vesco was also heavily involved in the narcotics traffic, according to accounts here. And as indicated, author Jim Hogan in his book Spooks has speculated, and his speculation appears to have considerable merit, that Santos Trapacante, Mitch Warbell, and Robert Vesco were involved in using the proceeds from the drug trade to finance the arms trade and in turn to finance anti-communist death squad activity in Latin America. The use of the narcotics trade to finance death squads and the parallel police in Latin America and elsewhere is one of the things we're going to focus on in the third program in our projected 4-part series dealing with the interrelationship between the CIA, the narcotics trade, and, basically the interrelationship between the two. Now, this coming Sunday evening, for those people who are taping this or are listening to this program live, from 8 to 11, we're going to present sort of a mini Radio Free America about Iran-Gate and Contra-Gate. And for those people who eventually hear this by tape, that program will be available. It will go into the permanent archives as sort of a sub-Radio Free America. You can call it Radio Free America 25A. It'll be a one-step beyond show among the miscellaneous shows available. It'll be called Contra-Gate and Iran-Gate. And the Robert Vesco connections will be cropping up in the background of that. Several of the people now being mentioned in connection with Contra-Gate and Iran-Gate crop up in connection with Robert Vesco, Investors Overseas Services, and that scandal. We'll be coming back to Vesco, reviewing the material presented here, and talking about some of the new developments in Contra-Gate and Iran-Gate on Sunday evening. That will be available under the title of Contra-Gate, Iran-Gate for the benefit of people who eventually hear this by tape.
And indeed, with that, we are going to wrap it up for this evening. So before we go, actually I'm going to have Dave give the address for DAVCOR, so those of you out there who are listening and would like to get these tapes and have been unable to tape it yourself will be able to get just that.
Okay, now, the name of the company that stocks all of our Radio Free America shows, they also have our Guns of November programs on file, also a number of different miscellaneous One Step Beyond shows. The name of that company is called DAVCOR, spelled D-A-V as in Victor, K-O-R-E. They're located at Suite 1300D, as in DAVCOR, Space Park Way. 3 words just like it sounds, Space Park Way. That's in Mountain View, California, zip code 94043. The phone number is 415-969-3030. Write or phone to the attention of Paul. Once again, that's DAVCOR, Suite 1300D, Space Park Way, Mountain View, California, 94043. The phone number is area code 415-969-3030. Write or phone to the attention of Paul. And please be advised that neither myself nor Nip nor the station makes a dime off of that.
That's right. And again, we'd like to stress to you that those of you who can, by all means, tune in this Sunday. The seedlings that we have been planning over the years, and that as you've seen some of them back as recently as May in our broadcast then, and some of them going way back to when we first started this broadcast during the Carter administration, these seedlings are beginning to bear some very strange, but for an infrequent chance, some very public fruit. So we hope you will stick with us. We're going to be putting a lot of emphasis on this stuff this Sunday and beginning to tie some of these Radio Free America archive broadcasts into the current situation even more closely. So be there for that. With that, we are going to put it on the road, and we hope you will all join us then. Thank you for being with us, and we will see you when we return on Sundays, of course, with One Step Beyond and with more Radio Free Americas right here. Broadcasting from Foothill College, this is KFJC, Los Altos Hills.